This story took place in 2007 in the Italian city of Perugia, where Amanda went as part of a student exchange program. Amanda settled into an apartment with 3 other girls, including British student Meredith Kircher. Initially, everything was going well. Amanda was learning Italian, making new friends, and working at a local bar. She was a typical student who wanted to gain new experiences and enjoy life in another country. But on November 1, 2007, a tragedy occurred that would forever change Amanda's life. Her roommate Meredith was found dead in their shared apartment. The girl was partially undressed, with deep cuts on her neck. It was clear that this was a brutal murder. The police immediately launched an investigation and began searching for possible suspects. Unfortunately, their attention quickly focused on Amanda and her boyfriend, Rafael Solicito. Investigators found some evidence that, in their opinion, pointed to the couple's involvement in the crime. This was the beginning of a long and complicated case that lasted many years and attracted worldwide attention. Amanda found herself at the center of the scandal and was accused of brutally murdering her friend. Her life turned into a real nightmare. There are many controversial moments and ambiguous facts in this case. Various pieces of evidence were presented, some of which raised doubts about their reliability. Testimonies were often inconsistent and confusing. Public opinion was divided. Some believed in Amanda's guilt, while others considered her an innocent victim. There are still many details and twists ahead in this story. We will learn more about Amanda's personality, the course of the investigation and the trial, the role of the media and the public in this case. We will try to figure out what really happened on that terrible night and whether the verdict was fair. So let's unravel this tangle of mysteries and riddles together, step by step. Perhaps we will be able to find answers to some questions and understand what Amanda Knox's true role was in this tragic story. So, let's learn more about Amanda Knox before she found herself at the center of this high-profile case. Amanda was born on July 9, 1987, in Seattle, Washington, USA. She grew up in an ordinary American family, not particularly standing out from her peers. From childhood, Amanda showed an interest in learning different languages and cultures. She was an active and sociable girl who easily made new acquaintances. At school, Amanda was particularly interested in literature and foreign languages, which later influenced her choice of future profession. After graduating from high school, Amanda entered the University of Washington, where she began studying Italian. It was this fascination with Italian that became one of the main reasons why she decided to go to Italy to study. Amanda devoted her university years not only to studying, but also to actively participating in student life, joining various youth communities and interest groups. In 2007, Knox learned about a student exchange program that allowed her to spend a whole year in Italy. She immediately decided to take this opportunity and chose the city of Perugia as her destination, one of the oldest university centers in Italy, known for its rich history and culture. For a young girl who wanted to improve her knowledge of Italian and immerse herself in an authentic environment, Perugia seemed like the perfect place. Before leaving for Italy, Amanda had already earned a reputation as a diligent student and an active participant in university life. She not only studied well, but also found time for social activities and volunteering. Amanda participated in various student clubs, especially those related to the study of foreign languages and intercultural exchange. Amanda's interest in Italy was not limited to language and literature. She was fascinated by Italian art, cuisine, and traditions. Amanda dreamed of seeing the masterpieces of Italian artists with her own eyes, tasting real pasta and pizza, and communicating with locals. She was confident that a year in Italy would be an unforgettable adventure for her and would help not only improve her language skills, but also better understand herself and the world around her. Unfortunately, fate had completely different plans for Knox. What was supposed to be a year of dreams turned into the worst nightmare of her life. No one, including Amanda herself, could have imagined the ordeals that awaited her in Perugia and how one tragic event would forever change her fate. So this was Amanda Knox before finding herself at the center of the most high-profile criminal case of the decade. An ordinary girl from an ordinary American family who just wanted to study, develop, and explore the world. She had no idea that very soon her name would be on the front pages of all the world's newspapers, but for far from pleasant reasons. In the summer of 2007, she finally arrived in the long-awaited Perugia, a small but incredibly picturesque city in the heart of Umbria. Amanda settled into a cozy apartment that she shared with 3 other girls, including British student Meredith Kircher. Meredith, like Amanda, came to Italy on a student exchange program. It would seem that the 2 young foreigners had a lot in common. Young age, love of travel, desire to learn about another culture. At first, the girls got along well, sharing impressions of their new life and making plans for the future. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. The first weeks in Perugia were a real fairy tale for Amanda. She immersed herself in the local student life, attending lectures at the university, participating in various events, meeting new people. Amanda continued to improve her Italian not only in classes, but also in live communication with locals. Her energy, openness, and genuine interest in everything new helped her quickly adapt to life in a foreign country. To have her own pocket money, Amanda got a job at the Le Chic Bar, which was owned by Patrick Lumumba, a native of Congo. This job gave her the opportunity not only to earn a little money, but also to delve deeper into the atmosphere of the city and meet different people. It was at this bar that Amanda met her new boyfriend, a young Italian named Raffaele Sollecito. It seemed that everything was going as well as possible. But despite the carefree first months, Knox had to get used to some peculiarities of life in Italy that differed from the American way of life she was used to. A different culture, a different rhythm of life, different rules of the game, all this required some effort and time to adapt. But Amanda, with her curiosity and love of life, gladly accepted these challenges. However, fate was already preparing completely different trials for Amanda. On November 1, 2007, her roommate Meredith Kircher was found brutally murdered in their shared apartment. This tragedy came as a real shock to everyone and completely turned Amanda's life upside down. From a carefree student, she instantly turned into the main suspect in a terrible crime. Thus began a long and complicated story that would define Amanda Knox's fate for years to come and make her name known all over the world. A story full of riddles, contradictions, and unexpected twists. A story about how a dream can turn into a nightmare, and an ordinary life can turn into a courtroom thriller. What really happened on that fatal night? Was Amanda really involved in the murder of her friend? The answers to these questions were sought for many years, and we will return to them more than once. On November 1, 2007, in the apartment in Perugia where Amanda Knox lived with other female students, a terrible tragedy occurred. Meredith Kircher, one of Amanda's roommates, was found dead in her room. Her body was covered with numerous wounds, and deep cuts were visible on her neck, indicating an extremely brutal murder. This shocking event not only stunned the entire student dormitory, but also shook the entire local community. Perugia, known for its calm and safe university town atmosphere, suddenly found itself in the spotlight due to one of the most high-profile crimes in Italian history. The police immediately launched an investigation. The main task of the first days was to reconstruct the picture of events on that fatal night, to understand what exactly happened in the apartment and who could have committed such a brutal murder. Investigators began questioning everyone who was in any way connected with Meredith, primarily her roommates, including Amanda Knox, and very quickly, the attention of the police and the public focused on Amanda. Why? Because some details in her behavior and testimony aroused suspicion. For example, there were certain inconsistencies in her stories about where she was and what she was doing that night. The police were also alerted by Amanda's unusual, in their opinion, reactions to what had happened. In addition to Amanda, her boyfriend, Italian Raffaele Sollecito, also fell under suspicion. Investigators collected some evidence that, in their opinion, pointed to the couple's possible involvement in the crime. In particular, during a search of Raffaele's apartment, a knife was confiscated on which traces of blood were found, and on the bra of the murdered Meredith, experts found Raffaele's DNA. These findings later became some of the key pieces of evidence for the prosecutions. However, as it turned out later, the investigation also had significant shortcomings. Many experts criticized the methods of collecting and processing physical evidence, pointing out the possibility of their accidental or intentional contamination during investigative actions. This called into question the reliability and admissibility of some of the evidence. Meanwhile, the case was gaining more and more publicity. A real media frenzy erupted around the investigation. The media around the world began closely following every move of the police, relishing the details and putting forward their own versions of events. Against the backdrop of this unhealthy interest and constant pressure, Amanda and Raffaele found themselves at the center of a real storm that mixed real facts with speculation and rumors. This atmosphere of public hysteria and bias created very difficult conditions for conducting a fair and impartial investigation and trial. And although at that time no one knew how this story would end, it was clear that it would not be an easy walk for any of the participants. Thus, the tragic death of Meredith Kircher marked the beginning of one of the most complicated and controversial criminal cases in modern history. a case that became a real test for the justice system and raised more questions than it gave answers. And although we now know its finale, believe me, the path to the truth was very long and winding. On November 6, 2007, just a few days after the brutal murder of Meredith Kercher, Amanda Knox and her boyfriend Rafael Solicito were arrested. This step by the Italian police was the result of the evidence collected, which investigators considered convincing enough to bring charges. Among this evidence were certain discrepancies in the suspects' statements regarding their whereabouts and actions on the night of the murder. The police also referred to some physical evidence found at the crime scene that allegedly pointed to Amanda and Rafael's involvement in this tragedy. In addition to them, Patrick Lumumba, the owner of the bar where Amanda worked, was also arrested. The reason for his arrest was a mention of him in one of Amanda's first statements. However, she later claimed that she gave this testimony under pressure from the investigators. The case instantly attracted enormous attention from the international community. At the center of this media storm was Amanda Knox, a young American who, in the eyes of the public, turned from a gifted student into the main suspect in a brutal murder. The media dubbed her Foxy Knoxy and began to portray her as a cunning and dangerous person. This biased presentation of information further complicated an already difficult case. The trial began in 2008. Prosecutors presented their version of events. According to their theory, Amanda, Rafael, and another man, Rudy Ged, a native of Ivory Coast who had already been convicted of this crime in a separate trial, committed the murder of Meredith during some kind of perverted sex game that got out of control. The prosecution relied on physical evidence from the crime scene and the suspect's testimonies, which contained many inconsistencies and strange details. On the other hand, Amanda Knox's lawyers insisted that her initial confessions were obtained under duress, and all the evidence against her was collected in violation of procedure and could have been contaminated during processing. The defense also emphasized that Amanda's DNA was not found on key pieces of physical evidence, such as the murder weapon. In addition, the defense subjected the methods of conducting the investigation and the entire Italian justice system to scathing criticism, claiming numerous violations of the suspect's rights to a fair trial. Meanwhile, the public was divided in its assessments of this complicated case. A significant part of Italian society was inclined to believe in the guilt of Amanda and Rafael. On the other hand, in the USA, the prevailing opinion was that the young people were being unfairly persecuted and that the real perpetrators of this terrible crime were not the ones on the dock. These contradictory judgments and polarity of opinions created an extremely tense atmosphere around the trial. It seemed that finding the truth in this tangle of mutually exclusive facts and conjectures would be extremely difficult. And although at that moment the finale of this drama was not yet known, it was clear to everyone that a long and exhausting struggle lay ahead for Amanda, Rafael, and their loved ones. The trial of Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito was a real test for the Italian justice system. It took place under the close attention of the world media and was accompanied by fierce public debates. The focus was on the evidence collected by the prosecution, as well as how this evidence was presented and interpreted by prosecutors and lawyers. The prosecution placed particular emphasis on several key elements. Firstly, the presence of Rafael Solicito's DNA on the clasp of the murdered Meredith Kercher's bra. Prosecutors argued that this finding was irrefutable proof of Rafael's presence at the crime scene at the time of the murder. Secondly, the investigation emphasized the mixed DNA samples of Amanda and Meredith found in the bathroom of their shared apartment. These traces, according to the prosecution, indicated that Amanda was present during the attack on Meredith or immediately after it and tried to cover up the traces. Thirdly, the prosecutors painted a rather unflattering psychological portrait of Amanda Knox. They portrayed her as a cold, calculating, and manipulative person. To support this characterization, they cited evidence of Amanda's strange and not entirely adequate behavior in the first days after the murder. Her alleged inability to show empathy and emotions that would befit an innocent person in such a tragic situation. On the other hand, Amanda and Rafael's defense built its strategy on questioning the reliability and admissibility of the collected evidence. Lawyers argued that in the process of collecting and analyzing physical evidence, significant violations were committed that could lead to their accidental or intentional contamination, and this, accordingly, made such evidence unreliable and unsuitable for use in court. Another important argument of the defense was the unreliability of Amanda's initial testimony. Her lawyers claimed that this testimony was obtained as a result of long and exhausting interrogations conducted without the participation of a lawyer and an interpreter. Under such conditions, according to the defenders, Amanda could break down and provide false testimony that did not correspond to reality. In addition, Knox and Solicito's lawyers drew attention to the absence in the case file of a clear motive that could explain why young people who had no problems with the law suddenly decided to commit such a brutal murder. The defense insisted that the prosecution had failed to provide a convincing answer to this question. It is also important to note the role of the media in this high-profile case. The media closely followed every day of the trial, relishing the smallest details and often taking one side or the other. Some publications openly sympathized with the prosecution, portraying Amanda as a cunning and immoral person. Others, on the contrary, sympathized with the defendants and criticized the actions of the prosecutor's office and the court. Such media bias further fueled passions in society and created additional difficulties for the administration of impartial justice. Thus, the trial of Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito turned out to be a real battlefield between the prosecution and the defense, where each side tried to present its version of events and convince the jury of its rightness. This confrontation was accompanied by active media intervention and close public attention, which only increased the tension and drama of the situation. And although at that time no one knew how this story would end, it was clear to everyone that it would not be an easy walk. This decision caused a considerable resonance both in Italy and abroad, especially in the USA, Amanda's homeland. Many Americans were shocked and outraged by this verdict, considering it unfair and biased. In the States, calls began to be made for a review of the case, and Amanda herself turned into almost a symbol of the fight against an imperfect justice system. The case gained not only wide public attention, but also a political coloring. American high-ranking officials, including then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, expressed concern about the fate of their compatriot and called on the Italian authorities to ensure a fair consideration of the appeal. Amanda Knox's story sparked heated debates in Italian society about the state of the criminal justice system, investigative methods, and the problem of the arbitrariness of law enforcement. Many were outraged by how ineptly and tendentiously the police and the prosecutor's office worked, how easily they rejected evidence that did not fit into their version, and how peremptorily they imposed their point of view. For Amanda Knox herself, this story had very serious and dramatic consequences. Even after the final acquittal, it was very difficult for the girl to return to a normal life and get rid of the stigma of a murderer. Her name will forever remain inextricably linked with this high-profile and controversial case. In order to somehow mitigate the negative consequences of what happened, Amanda wrote an autobiographical book and also actively got involved in the work of organizations that help people who have been unjustly convicted or accused of serious crimes. She seeks to draw society's attention to the problems of miscarriages of justice and investigative arbitrariness, warning that anyone can end up behind bars due to an imperfect system. One of the most striking aspects of the Amanda Knox case was the unprecedented media coverage it received. It seemed that the whole world, with bated breath, was following every twist and turn of this detective story. Particularly close attention was paid to the figure of Amanda herself, a young American woman who found herself at the epicenter of this storm. It must be admitted that the media played an extremely ambiguous role in this story. On the one hand, they performed their usual function informing the public about the course of events. But on the other hand, in pursuit of sensationalism and ratings, many media outlets openly speculated on this topic, fueling hysteria and stirring up emotions. The tabloids, both Italian and British, were especially zealous. They quickly stuck the label Foxy Knoxy on Amanda, hinting at her alleged cunning and ability to manipulate people. This image of a sexually liberated, immoral American woman was firmly entrenched in the mass consciousness and undoubtedly greatly harmed Amanda. In general, the media often exploited cliches and stereotypes, contrasting depraved American culture with traditional values of Italian society. Amanda was portrayed as the embodiment of all the vices of modern youth: selfishness, irresponsibility, promiscuity. And Italian justice, accordingly, looked like a bastion of morality and order. Of course, such pressure from the media could not but affect the atmosphere around the trial. It created additional pressure on judges and jurors, because everyone understood that millions of eyes were closely watching their every word and gesture. In such conditions, it was extremely difficult to remain impartial and objective. Public opinion on the case was divided. In Italy, many were inclined to the version of Amanda and Raphael's guilt, believing that the 2009 verdict restored justice. They say the arrogant American was quite rightly punished for a terrible crime. On the other hand, in the United States, sympathies for Amanda prevailed. Most Americans were convinced that their compatriot had become a victim of a biased and incompetent investigation, that she was convicted on the basis of circumstantial evidence and speculation. It is not surprising if the Knox case quickly acquired a political coloring. And although Amanda and Raphael were eventually acquitted, this story had serious and long-term consequences. In particular, it forced the Italian authorities to think about the need for reforms in the criminal justice system. After all, it became obvious that the current procedures for collecting and evaluating evidence are far from perfect, and the rights of suspects and accused are often violated. At the same time, the Knox case gave impetus to a discussion about ethical standards in journalism. Many experts pointed out the unacceptability of such irresponsible and biased coverage of high-profile criminal cases. After all, media pressure and whipping up hysteria seriously affect public sentiment and can push the court to make politically motivated decisions. One cannot fail to mention the cultural impact of the Amanda Knox case. Based on these events, many books were written, several documentaries and feature films were made. Each such work offered its own interpretation of what happened, placed its own accents and evaluated the characters in its own way. In general, this story left a deep mark on the collective memory and continues to influence the image of Italy, especially in terms of the impartiality and professionalism of its justice system. There is no doubt that interest in the Amanda Knox case will not fade for many years to come, because it has become the embodiment of the eternal human drama, the clash of good and evil, truth and falsehood, justice and prejudice. In December 2009, an Italian court found Amanda Knox and her then-boyfriend Raphael Solicito guilty of the murder of British student Meredith Kercher. Amanda was sentenced to 26 years in prison, Raphael to 25 years. It would seem that a line had been drawn under this high-profile case. But in reality, everything was just beginning. The fact is that the verdict caused considerable indignation and protests both in Italy and abroad, especially in the United States. Many believed that the court was biased and the evidence unconvincing and contradictory. Under pressure from the public and the efforts of the defense team, a retrial was scheduled in 2010. And in 2013, what supporters of Amanda and Raphael had been waiting for so long happened. The appellate court heeded the arguments of the defense and agreed to reconsider the key evidence in the case. In particular, independent experts were called in who seriously questioned the reliability and admissibility of some of the physical evidence presented by the prosecution. It turned out that in the collection and storage of this evidence, significant violations were committed that could lead to their accidental or deliberate contamination. That is, it could not be said with certainty that, for example, the DNA of the suspects on certain items got there precisely during the commission of the crime and not got there through the negligence of the investigators. This expert testimony was decisive. In October 2011, the appellate court overturned the conviction and declared Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito not guilty of the murder of Meredith Kercher. They were immediately released from custody, and Amanda was finally able to return home to Seattle. But even with that, the case did not end. The prosecution appealed the decision of the appellate court to the Supreme Court of Cassation of Italy, and in March 2013, this court unexpectedly overturned the acquittal and ordered a retrial. This turn of events shocked many and caused a new surge of public outrage. However, during the new appellate process in 2014, the prosecution again failed to provide compelling evidence of Amanda and Raphael's guilt. Finally, in March 2015, the Italian Supreme Court upheld their final acquittal and closed the case. This time forever. After all these dramatic events, Amanda Knox returned to the United States and tried to start a new life. However, as you can imagine, it was very difficult for her to do this. She will forever remain a person whose name is inextricably linked with one of the loudest and most controversial trials of our time. Knox did not hide from this burden. On the contrary, she decided to use her experience and popularity to draw attention to the problems of the criminal justice system. She began to actively advocate for reforms, give interviews, and write books. Her case has become a kind of symbol of a miscarriage of justice and a call for greater caution and responsibility in the investigation and consideration of criminal cases. In general, this story left us with many lessons. It showed how important it is to strictly adhere to procedural norms when collecting and using evidence. How powerful and dangerous the influence of the media and public opinion on the course of a trial can be, and how difficult it is to correct a miscarriage of justice if it has already occurred. The Amanda Knox case will forever go down in history as an example that even the loudest and seemingly obvious accusations can sometimes turn out to be false. and that the right to a fair trial and the presumption of innocence must be reliably protected under any circumstances. The Central Coast of New South Wales in Australia conceals a place with a grim reputation, Snapper Point, also known as the Deadly Cliffs. Despite being a popular tourist attraction, especially among fishing enthusiasts, this location is notorious for its steep, jagged cliffs. It's not uncommon for people to fall from these slopes straight into the turbulent ocean or get swept away by sudden waves. In recent years, at least 16 tourists have lost their lives in this area. However, as practice shows, it's not always just a blind chance or the whims of nature that cause these deaths. This story is about one such case. On April 24, 2016, around 10:30 in the morning, several visiting fishermen were going about their business near Snapper Point. Suddenly, some of them, looking down from the cliffs, noticed a strange object beating against the waves. It quickly became clear that it was a body wrapped in black plastic, another victim of the treacherous Deadly Cliffs. One of the witnesses immediately reported the gruesome find to the police. Soon, a rescue helicopter arrived at the scene to retrieve the body, which was lying face down. But from the first glance, the specialist realized that this was no mere accident. The discovered body belonged to a young girl and had over 30 stab wounds. Particularly deep blows were inflicted on the neck, and there were traces on the hands and wrists indicating desperate attempts to defend herself. Unfortunately, the victim's clothing was never found, which significantly complicated the process of identifying her. The primary task for the police was to establish the identity of the deceased, and only then reconstruct the chain of events that led the girl to the medical examiner's table. But recognizing her proved to be difficult. There were no distinctive features or characteristic details of appearance. The expert determined that death occurred as a result of a brutal stabbing, and the defensive wounds on the hands indicated that the girl fought for her life until the very end. The fact that the body was found naked suggested a probable rape, but it was impossible to confirm or refute this version. The water washed away all potential evidence. To help identify the victim, law enforcement officers created a computer reconstruction of her appearance and published it online, dubbing the deceased Snapper Point Jane Doe. The girl had Asian facial features, looked to be 20 to 35 years old, was of average build, about 5 feet 7 inches tall, with dark chestnut shoulder-length hair. The condition of the body suggested that it had been in the water for a relatively short time. Questioning fishermen and other potential witnesses yielded no results. No one saw anyone throw a dead girl from the cliffs into the water. The police began a large-scale check of all recently missing persons in the region, both local residents and tourists. Special attention was paid to those who might have lost contact with loved ones, friends, or girlfriends. At the same time, an active search was underway among foreigners who had recently arrived in Australia. And so, quite quickly, people responded who noticed a striking resemblance between the mysterious victim and a Chinese student who had come to Australia on an exchange 4 years ago. They immediately reported this to the police. The very next Friday after the body was discovered, the detectives working on the case were able to establish the identity of the deceased. She turned out to be 25-year-old Michelle Leng, who had gone missing at the time of her death. As it turned out, Michelle lived in the suburb of Campsie, in Sydney, about 100 kilometers from the place where her mutilated body was found. And here's a chilling coincidence. Just a year before her death, the girl took a photo on the very cliff from which her dead body was later thrown. In the picture, Michelle posed against the backdrop of water and cliffs, as if anticipating her own fate. When the media picked up this news, rumors began to spread that the girl had come to this place to meet a guy she had met online, and this date turned out to be fatal for her. Journalists spun the version that an unknown suitor literally lured Michelle to her death, but the police promptly worked out this version and refuted it. A detailed analysis of the girl's correspondence and messengers showed that she did not meet anyone and did not plan any meetings. So who and why did someone need to cut short the life of a young student? To answer this question, investigators had to delve deeper into the details of Michelle's life and surroundings. The nature of the crime, extreme brutality, and a large number of stab wounds indicated a personal motive. The police did not abandon hope of finding the killer's trail. It was established that Michelle Leng was born in China in 1991 and had been very close to her mother, Mei Jiang, all her life. Michelle Leng's life path was full of trials from a young age. A heavy blow to the family was the death of the girl's father during a devastating earthquake that occurred in her hometown in China. This tragedy not only took the life of the closest person, but also put the family in a difficult financial situation. However, despite all the hardships, mother and daughter became even more united in the face of difficulties. Their relationship became stronger, and their emotional bond became unbreakable. Michelle acutely felt responsible for the fate of her mother and understood that without her support, they were unlikely to survive. It was then, in search of a better life and opportunities to help her family, that the girl made the decision to radically change her life. She began to consider options for moving to another country, where she could find a promising job and get a quality education. And her choice fell on distant Australia. In 2011, full of hope and expectations, Michelle Leng arrived in Sydney, the largest city on the green continent. The girl was sure that it was here, in this metropolis of opportunities, that she would be able to realize her dreams and ambitions. And at first, it seemed that fate was smiling upon her. Michelle adapted to the new realities fairly quickly, made new friends, and settled her life. She became a student at the University of Technology, Sydney, choosing economics and business as her specialty. In parallel with her studies, the girl found a job in order to be able to financially support her mother. It is worth noting that Michelle, without hesitation, sent her first salary to her mother in China. And from then on, every month she transferred money to her family, because deep in her heart, she understood how important her help was for them. In Australia, Michelle was lucky with housing. She did not have to rent an apartment, because her relatives themselves suggested that the girl should live with them in an apartment complex in the Sydney suburb of Campsie. There she lived with her 48-year-old aunt, her teenage son from a previous marriage, and her 28-year-old uncle, Derek Barrett, who was Michelle's second cousin and had been married to her aunt since 2012. For the girl's mother, this arrangement was a great relief because she knew that her daughter was under the supervision of relatives. This gave her peace of mind and confidence that nothing bad would happen to Michelle, and the girl herself enjoyed the company of close relatives. She had a warm, trusting relationship with her aunt and uncle. They seemed to Michelle to be decent, reliable people with whom one could not only share a roof over their heads, but also share the most intimate things. In addition, living with family allowed the girl to send more money to her mother, because it was possible to significantly save on housing rent. To better understand what kind of person Michelle was, investigators thoroughly studied her social media pages. There they searched for the smallest details, seemingly insignificant facts that could shed light on the identity of the deceased and, most importantly, lead to the trail of the killer. Law enforcement officers scrupulously analyzed the girl's posts, comments, likes, and photos. They checked recent calls and messages to understand who Michelle had been communicating with recently, what plans and intentions she had. This work was painstaking but extremely necessary. From the profiles on social networks, a picture emerged of a happy life of a young girl, filled with bright moments. Michelle often shared positive emotions and life-affirming thoughts with friends, loved to philosophize on topics that excited her soul. Among the publications, there were many selfies with friends against the backdrop of picturesque Australian landscapes. A special place was occupied by culinary masterpieces, which Michelle loved to show off so much. The girl adored cooking and sharing the results of her efforts on the web. It seemed that Michelle lived a tasty life in every sense of the word. Together with her friends, she often visited cafes and restaurants, tried new dishes, and studied the intricacies of local cuisine. Another passion of hers was animals, nature, and beaches. Photos from the picturesque corners of Australia appeared on the girl's pages from time to time. However, despite the richness of the newsfeed, the detectives could not find any hint of any suspicious acquaintances or dangerous connections. Then the investigators decided to talk to Michelle's closest circle, her friends and housemates. From them, it became known that the girl last got in touch on April 21st, 2016. Then she told her friends that she was planning a trip to the mall for shopping. Around noon, Michelle got on a train and went about her business. Later, the police obtained footage from surveillance cameras at the shopping center. They clearly showed the girl strolling between the rows of stores, trying things on, and buying new clothes in different departments. Her entire route through the mall was traced in detail, up to the moment when Michelle boarded the return train to Campsie. But what happened to the girl next remained a mystery. After all, there were no cameras along the way from the station to the house where Michelle lived. The last clue was that the girl logged into her media platform one more time after returning, but then her online activity stopped. Most likely, it was at that moment that something terrible happened to her. It was also strange that Michelle disappeared on Thursday, and already on Sunday, her mutilated body was found tens of kilometers from home, on the cliffs at Snapper Point. And the first to fall under suspicion were her housemates, her aunt with her husband and their son. The woman confessed to the police that on the day of her niece's disappearance, she was in another city on business, so she did not even know whether Michelle had returned from shopping. But her husband, the deceased's uncle Derek Barrett, allegedly spent the whole evening at home. According to him, they had dinner together and then he went to bed. When he woke up in the morning, Michelle was already gone. The man assumed that his niece, like many girls her age, was having fun somewhere with friends, maybe even stayed overnight with someone. So at first, no one attached much importance to this. But when the girl did not show up at home on Saturday, Derek became worried. He began to write messages to Michelle, but in response, silence. The girl's mother, who was used to communicating with her daughter every day, was no less worried. Usually they talked a lot on the phone, but this time, Michelle seemed to have vanished into thin air. The aunt, returning home on Sunday, decided to look into her niece's room, and two things alerted her. Firstly, all of Michelle's things were in their places. It seemed that the girl was not going to go anywhere for a long time. And secondly, perfect cleanliness reigned in the room, as if Michelle had put things in order before something. And this was also very strange. The aunt and uncle, shocked by the suspicious circumstances of Michelle's disappearance, decided to contact the police. Their statement was received almost simultaneously with the message from the girl's friends, who actively disseminated information about her disappearance on the web. Thanks to Michelle's wide circle of acquaintances, the news of her disappearance spread like lightning across the internet and became public knowledge. The publication on the Chinese website Weibo turned out to be especially resonant. It helped to link the unidentified body found on the cliffs with the missing student. Detectives, having processed all available information about Michelle, came to the conclusion that the girl had no obvious ill-wishers. In addition, she was quite smart and savvy to stand up for herself if necessary. Cheerful and sociable, Michelle was unlikely to become a victim of a targeted murder. So the police suggested that it could have been an attack by some maniac operating in the area. However, no other similar crimes were recorded in the area. While Michelle's killer was freely roaming at large, the public was increasingly worried about their own safety and expressed dissatisfaction with the actions of law enforcement officers. It seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end. Considering all possible versions, the investigators did not rule out racist motives. After all, the victim was an Asian girl. All students of the appropriate origin were warned about the potential danger. Until the criminal was at large, none of them could feel safe. Society demanded that the police solve the murder and arrest the suspect as soon as possible. Michelle's grief-stricken mother arrived in Australia to meet with the relatives with whom her daughter lived until her death. The woman gave several interviews to the press in which she promised to make every effort to find the dangerous criminal. She was full of determination and put a lot of pressure on the police. From her, journalists learned that Michelle's grandmother could not withstand the news of her granddaughter's death and died of a heart attack. Thus, the killer took the lives of two family members at once. First of all, The investigators thoroughly checked the alibis of Michelle's closest circle. Her aunt had reliable confirmation that on the day of her niece's disappearance, she was on a business trip in a small town south of Sydney. This was evidenced by several witnesses, as well as tickets for transport and surveillance camera recordings. The woman herself was very hard going through the tragedy, blaming herself for not protecting Michelle. In her opinion, if she had not left home on that ill-fated day, then perhaps she could have prevented the disaster and saved her niece's life. The deceased's cousin, who lived with Michelle, her aunt, and his stepfather, also had an alibi. On the day of the girl's disappearance, he was engaged in everyday affairs, went to school, met with friends. Unlike Uncle Derek, the boy admitted that he did not see his sister on Thursday. Derek himself claimed that he spent the whole day at the computer. Being an IT specialist, the man supposedly worked hard on urgent projects that he had to complete by Monday. Michelle's cousin confirmed that his uncle really did not leave the computer then, but the boy could vouch for only about 3 hours spent with Derek in the apartment. Subsequently, the teenager made a shocking confession to the investigation. In general, neither Derek nor his stepson had a reliable alibi, so the police bombarded them with questions. After the first interrogation, Derek suddenly changed his testimony. It turned out that in fact, he left the house and met with some girl while his wife was away. This detail immediately attracted the attention of investigators. When asked why he did not tell about this immediately, the man referred to problems with drug addiction. Allegedly, due to the use of psychotropic substances, he has memory lapses, so he remembers the events of that day very vaguely. Such a confession sharply contrasted with the previous image of a decent family man that Derek was trying to create, and he could not provide the contacts of the girl with whom he allegedly met, so no one believed this version. Then Derek changed his testimony again. Now he stated that he was simply afraid to admit to cheating so as not to lose his wife if she found out about everything. This story seemed extremely dubious to the detectives. In addition, they noticed discrepancies in the testimony of Derek and his stepson, so the investigators' suspicions focused on the figure of Michelle's stepfather. To shed light on this dark story, the police decided to find out more about Derek Barrett and study the information from his mobile phone. By tracking the geolocation, law enforcement officers found that literally half an hour before the discovery of Michelle's body, the suspect's phone lit up 10 kilometers from Snapper Point. After reviewing the footage from surveillance cameras, investigators recorded how Derek refueled his car at a gas station near the crime scene. There, he also bought some drinks, paying with a bank card. The surveillance camera footage at the gas station clearly captured Derek Barrett, leaving no doubt about his presence in the area. So the detectives decided to ask what the suspect was doing so close to where Michelle's body was found shortly before its discovery. The man explained his presence at Snapper Point by visiting relatives. As it later turned out, Derek knew these places very well, as he was born and raised nearby. Moreover, a year ago, it was he who took Michelle to Snapper Point, where the girl even managed to take several photos against the backdrop of picturesque cliffs. However, such a coincidence seemed extremely dubious to the investigators, although they understood that it would not be easy to prove Derek's involvement in the crime. However, intuition persistently suggested to the cops that it was worth digging deeper in the direction of Barrett. So they obtained permission for a more detailed study of the contents of his mobile phone, hoping to find at least some clues that would link the suspect with the victim. And their efforts were not in vain. Thanks to special programs, experts were able to restore a lot of deleted photos and videos that shocked seasoned police officers. In many frames, Michelle was completely naked and, it seems, did not even suspect that she was being filmed secretly. The girl carelessly slept or took a shower while Derek voyeuristically recorded her on camera. But the most chilling discovery were the clips in which the unfortunate Michelle lay on the bed tied up, with a gag in her mouth. Her gaze, full of despair and pleas for salvation, left no doubt. The girl became a victim of brutal violence against her will. This evidence from Derek's phone actually confirmed his guilt in the death of his niece. The collected materials were more than enough to consider Barrett not just the main suspect, but actually Michelle's killer. So on April 30th, Derek was arrested and taken into custody. However, the man immediately began to deny any involvement in the crime. The defendant's lawyer petitioned for his client's release on bail, but the defense's argument sounded unconvincing. Derek himself, through his attorney, expressed genuine surprise at the suspicions and arrest. Despite this, his wife, the aunt of the deceased Michelle, immediately filed for divorce. The woman was stunned by what had been happening within the walls of her house right under her nose. How could she have failed to notice all these warning signs earlier? She and her son immediately cut off all relations with Derek. Investigators determined that the photos of Michelle bound and gagged were taken on the day of her disappearance. Thus, the girl simply had no chance to tell anyone about the violence she had endured. Derek had personally documented his horrific crime against his defenseless niece on his phone. Earlier recordings were also found where he abused Michelle in a somewhat milder form. The girl probably did not realize the full danger, which is why she remained silent about her uncle's perversions. The collected evidence allowed investigators to reconstruct the picture of what happened on that fateful day of April 21st, 2016. When Michelle returned home, Derek snuck into her room and forcibly made her undress. Then he tied the girl up and gagged her. Recording all of this on camera, the pervert at his victim. Soon after, Michelle's cousin, her aunt's son, returned home. The boy reported that for almost the entire time he was in the apartment, he did not see his stepfather but only heard some sounds. Apparently, water was constantly running in the shower, and Derek wasn't coming out for some reason. This seemed suspicious to the teenager, so he even became a bit worried. He approached the bathroom door and asked his stepfather if everything was all right. Hearing an affirmative response, the boy calmed down somewhat. Still, it was strange that Derek had been in the shower for almost 3 hours straight. During all this time, the man only opened the door once to ask his stepson to hand him some shampoo he had supposedly forgotten in the room. At the same time, Derek did not allow the boy to enter. Michelle's cousin sensed something was wrong but didn't dare to argue with his stepfather. At that moment, the teenager had no idea that he had narrowly missed witnessing the violence and that he could have saved his sister if he had insisted. The boy had no idea that Michelle was at home all this time. After all, judging by everything, she was tied up in her room upstairs. Shortly after her cousin left for a walk with friends, the unfortunate girl met her death at the hands of the perverted sadist. Derek managed to conceal the exact course of events and circumstances of the murder. The man claimed that due to drug use, he suffered from amnesia, so he simply didn't remember the details. It is only known that after the killing, Michelle's body ended up in the trunk of Derek's car. On April 23rd, the day after the murder, surveillance cameras on a neighboring house recorded the suspect taking out the trash from his home 4 times. Most likely, this was Derek's attempt to get rid of blood traces in the room. Then the man took the body to Sniper Point, the place where Michelle's mutilated remains were later discovered. Recordings from other surveillance cameras confirm that around 7 in the morning on April 24th, Derek's car entered the territory of Lake Manmora National Park. Just a few hours later, the girl's body was found by fishermen at the foot of the cliffs. The collected evidence was quite sufficient to prove Derek Barrett's guilt. The only chance for the defendant to avoid responsibility could have been declaring him insane. This is what the man's defense insisted on, using his claimed amnesia as an argument. However, the conclusions of the psychiatric examination were disappointing for Derek. The doctors did not find any deviations or disorders in him that could have affected his awareness of his own actions. This meant that the man was fully capable of standing trial and answering for his actions. So, after consulting with his lawyer, Derek Barrett decided to plead guilty to all charges, hoping to mitigate his sentence this way. During the trial, he tearfully apologized several times to those present, especially to his victim's mother. However, even in the dock, Derek continued to insist that drug problems had led to lapses in his memory. During the court hearing, Derek Barrett repeatedly stated that the events of that fateful day were forever etched in his memory, not allowing him to sleep peacefully at night. The man claimed that he was tormented by nightmares from which he would wake up in tears. The accused even expressed remorse for his actions, assuring that he sincerely regretted the consequences of his deeds. However, Derek continued to insist that on the day of the murder, he was under the strong influence of narcotics, which caused him to be unaware of his actions and unable to recall the details of what had happened. While in prison, he even wrote a letter to his victim's mother, May, in which he begged for forgiveness. In his message, Derek apologized 1,000 times for what he had done, assuring that he deeply regretted the crime committed. But despite all his pleas, the court found Barrett guilty of first-degree murder and a whole series of other serious crimes. The incredible cruelty and perverted nature of the sexual violence Michelle endured became aggravating circumstances in the sentencing. Consequently, Derek was sentenced to 46 years in prison. According to Australian law, he will have the right to apply for parole after serving 34 years of this term. However, the story of Michelle Leng's suffering did not end there. In 2019, a fateful event occurred that shed light on the full scale of abuse the 25-year-old student from China endured before her horrific death. It happened when Michelle's aunt came to visit her elderly mother, who lived in Strathfield, another Sydney suburb. The girl's grandmother suffered from dementia, so her daughter had to visit the sick woman often. During one of these visits, the elderly lady was tightly clutching a small object in her hands. When her daughter asked to see what she had, the woman handed her a USB flash drive. Michelle's mother wondered what it was and what information it contained. Unfortunately, the grandmother couldn't answer these questions. She thought she was holding some kind of toy, so Michelle's aunt took the flash drive with her. Upon arriving home, the woman decided out of curiosity to see what might be on it. She inserted the drive into her computer and froze in horror at seeing its contents. The aunt immediately contacted the police, handing over the terrible find to law enforcement. The flash drive contained 13 photographs and 9 videos, with a total duration of over an hour. All these materials vividly demonstrated the horrific scale of abuse that poor Michelle endured in the last hours of her life. The video showed Derek bursting into the girl's room, brutally tossing her around like a rag doll, after which he repeatedly read her. Michelle's screams and pleas to stop the abuse seemed only to fuel her executioner's sadistic inclinations. Derek's face was frozen in a mask of perverted pleasure, and it didn't look at all like the man was under the influence of drugs, as he tried to prove in court. No, it seemed he was simply reveling in his power over the defenseless victim and deriving sick satisfaction from the very process of violence. But it still remains a mystery how the flash drive with these horrifying video evidence ended up with Michelle's grandmother. The old woman had no connection to either Derek or his victim. She lived quite far from Campsie, and she couldn't explain the origin of the USB drive herself due to progressive dementia. Eventually, the court was forced to review the charges against Derek Barrett in light of the newly discovered circumstances. He was charged with 9 additional counts related to sex crimes. This increased his prison term by 20 years, to 66, and the period after which Barrett can apply for parole increased to 36.5 years. The relatives of the deceased girl insisted that her killer should be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In their opinion, the terrible cruelty and perverted nature of the crime against poor Michelle could not have any other verdict. The judge took into account the appeal of the victim's loved ones, but noted that from a legal standpoint, life imprisonment was not possible in this case. So Derek Barrett will have the right to file his first petition for parole no earlier than 2052. But even this term seems too merciful, given the suffering that Michelle and her loved ones endured at his hands. After all, the girl came from her home to distant Australia not to become prey to a pervert who turned out to be a real wolf in sheep's clothing. Michelle was simply trying to help her mother and ease the financial burden on her family by agreeing to live with relatives and save on rent. The unfortunate victim silently endured abuse for 4 long years, hoping that one day it would finally stop. Unfortunately, instead of rescue, she was met with a tragic and premature death at the hands of her sadistic uncle. The tragic story of Michelle Leng is a bitter lesson for all of us. It reminds us how important it is to be vigilant and careful, even when it seems there is no danger. For sometimes evil hides where we least expect to see it. First and foremost, this story underscores the importance of open dialogue in the family. If Michelle had felt she could safely tell someone about what was happening, perhaps the tragedy could have been avoided. So creating an atmosphere of trust and mutual understanding between loved ones is the first step to preventing such situations. Also, this terrible story teaches us not to ignore warning signs. Perhaps if Michelle's relatives had been more attentive to changes in her behavior, they could have raised the alarm in time. So if you notice that something incomprehensible is happening with your loved ones, don't be afraid to reveal it and offer your help. Women and girls should be especially careful. Unfortunately, they most often become victims of domestic violence and perverted encroachments. So it's so important not to be silent, not to be ashamed, and not to endure abuse. If you feel something is wrong, immediately seek protection from relatives or contact law enforcement. Let Michelle's death not be in vain. Let's make her story a warning to all of us. Let's be more sensitive to our loved ones, more attentive to alarming bells, and always ready to come to the aid of those who need it. People are capable of horrific acts towards one another, but what could be worse than the cruelty of one's own parents? This is a story about Lacey, a girl whose life was cut short due to the inhumane conditions in which she was kept by her closest relatives. Lacey, we don't know much about her as she rarely appeared in public. According to neighbors' recollections, she was a cheerful, inquisitive child. She was passionate about volleyball, loved watching Disney cartoons, and listening to country music. A typical girl with a carefree childhood. But everything changed when Lacey turned 9. Her family, consisting of her mother Sheila and father Clay, decided to move to a new home in the town of Slaughter, Louisiana. Little did they know that this house would become a real prison for their daughter. When Lacey was supposed to start 9th grade, her parents suddenly decided to switch her to homeschooling. Perhaps they thought it would be better for the girl, but in reality it marked the beginning of her isolation from the outside world. I want you to imagine being locked within the 4 walls of your own house, without the opportunity to interact with peers, go to school, develop and explore the world. This is the situation young Lacey found herself in, and no one even suspected her suffering. What motivated Sheila and Clay to make such a choice? Did they realize the consequences of their actions? These questions remain unanswered to this day. But one thing is certain, their decision forever changed Lacey's life and led to tragic events. Moving to a new house and switching to homeschooling seemingly ordinary things that shouldn't raise suspicions. But in this case, they became the first steps towards the girl's horrific fate. So at the time of being transferred to homeschooling, Lacey was about 14 years old. It was during this period that her life turned into a real nightmare. The girl found herself in complete isolation from the outside world. As it turned out later, Lacey suffered from autism and a severe form of social phobia. These diagnoses became a life sentence for her. Over the years, the illness progressed, and the girl increasingly immersed herself in her own world, shutting herself off from reality. It can be assumed that it was precisely due to the exacerbation of Lacey's condition that her parents decided to switch her to homeschooling. Perhaps they thought it would be better for her, that she would feel safer in a home environment. But did they realize the consequences this isolation would lead to? Imagine a teenager who is afraid to step outside their own house, who doesn't have the opportunity to interact with peers, make friends, explore the world. For Lacey, with her diagnosis, it was a real ordeal. She found herself trapped by her own fears and limitations. But this is just the beginning of the tragedies the girl had to face. A girl who needed help and support found herself in complete isolation. And most terrifying of all, it happened through the fault of her own parents. Why didn't Sheila and Clay seek professional help for their daughter? Why did they decide that homeschooling and isolation were the solution? I want you, the one watching this video right now, to know that it's important to be attentive to those who need our help and support. Perhaps if someone had intervened, if someone had reached out to help Lacey, her fate would have been different. Years passed and Lacey became increasingly invisible to those around her. Neighbors who once frequently saw her on the street could now barely remember when they last encountered the girl. It was as if she had vanished behind the walls of her own house. Meanwhile, her parents, Sheila and Clay, continued to live their usual lives. Sheila worked as a court and police clerk and also had a small bakery nearby. It seemed like nothing special, just an ordinary job. But later, just before her daughter's death, Sheila got a job as an assistant prosecutor in Zachary and even became a member of the Slaughter City Council. A successful career, isn't it? And Lacey's father, Clay, was a respected member of the community. He represented the non-profit organization Civil War Round Table and was part of the Rotary Club. People respected him for his active community involvement and participation in city life. The Fletchers were an ordinary family that didn't stand out in any particular way. They irregularly attended the local church like many other town residents. No one could have imagined that behind the closed doors of their house, something terrible was happening. I often encounter situations where people are not always what they seem at first glance. Outwardly, the Fletchers were a respectable family, active members of the community. They didn't raise any suspicions or questions. But as it turned out, it was all just an illusion. While Lacey suffered in complete isolation, her parents continued to live their normal lives. They went to work, interacted with people, participated in community affairs. Meanwhile, their daughter was slowly fading away within four walls, without hope of rescue. Friends, creating this type of content requires a lot of time, and right now my channel and I are going through a challenging financial situation. I would be immensely grateful if you could become a sponsor of this channel and support me with your donation. In return, I will be able to personally respond to your comments and also mention your noble name in my video. So become a sponsor. I will be eternally grateful to you. From the moment Lacey was transferred to homeschooling, years passed, and the girl practically disappeared from the sight of those around her. During all this time, she was seen outside the house only once when she was 20 years old. A random passerby noticed Lacey exercising near her parents' house. Perhaps at that time, she still had a bit of freedom and strength to go out into the yard. The Fletcher's neighbor, Robert Blatz, was the last person to see Lacey alive. He recounted that he once spoke with Clay about the girl. He inquired about how she was doing and where she had gone, as she hadn't been seen for a long time. To which Clay briefly replied that his daughter lived with them, she was in the house, and quickly changed the subject. At the time, it didn't raise any suspicions for Robert. He likely knew about Lacey's social phobia and her health issues, so he didn't press further. Moreover, the Fletcher family had an impeccable reputation among neighbors. They were respected members of the community, and nothing indicated any possible trouble. From the perspective of my years lived and experience working in the police force, I often wonder how many tragedies could have been prevented if people were more attentive and caring. In this case, too, the neighbor inquired, received an answer that essentially clarified nothing and left it at that. He didn't ask uncomfortable questions, didn't become alarmed, didn't turn to the appropriate services. Of course, I don't blame Robert. He couldn't have known what was happening behind the closed doors at the Fletcher's house. But it makes one think about how often we, caught up in our own affairs and problems, simply don't notice the warning signs. We don't pay attention to the strange behavior of neighbors, colleagues, acquaintances. We consider it none of our business. Lacey practically vanished from the life of the community, and it didn't bother anyone. The girl who once played on the street and interacted with neighbors suddenly became invisible, and everyone accepted it as a given. One can only imagine the despair and loneliness Lacey experienced during those years. She was imprisoned not only physically within the walls of her own home, but also emotionally in the indifference and blindness of those around her. January 3, 2022, forever changed the lives of the Fletcher family and shook the entire local community. That day, Sheila called the police with a report that was difficult to comprehend. Her 36-year-old daughter Lacey had stopped breathing. How could this have happened? What had been going on in that house all these years while Lacey was isolated from the world? Rumors immediately began to circulate around this incident. Some claimed that Sheila dared to call the police only because someone from the neighbors was in their house at that moment. Allegedly, the very fact of an outsider's presence forced her to act. Otherwise, she would have continued to remain silent. One of the Fletcher's neighbors, who claimed to be in their house on that fateful day, said that Sheila would hardly have called the police if not for his presence. This leads one to wonder whether it was an attempt by the mother to conceal the traces of her terrible negligence and indifference. What really happened on that January day? I'm afraid we will never know all the details. The only thing known for certain is that Lacey was found dead in her own bed, in a house that should have been a cozy shelter for her, but instead became a place of suffering and death. The following days and weeks were filled with investigations, interrogations, and examinations. Local residents whispered and shared speculations, trying to understand how such a thing could happen in their quiet communities. However, no one could even imagine the full depth of the tragedy unfolding behind the walls of the Fletcher's house. Frankly, I have seen a lot of human grief and cruelty, but Lacey's story shocked me. Lacey's death marked the beginning of a long and painful process of seeking truth and justice. What law enforcement officers and medics saw in the Fletcher's house that January day will forever remain in their memory. In the living room on the couch, they discovered the body of 36-year-old Lacey Ellen Fletcher, who had been lying there for the last 12 years of her life. The scene that opened before their eyes was horrific. Lacey's body was disfigured by pressure sores, which had likely formed from prolonged contact with the surface of the couch. Her skin was covered in ulcers and her own excrement, indicating a complete absence of basic hygiene and care. The most shocking aspect was that insect larvae and rat droppings covered the girl's body. This suggested that she had literally rotted alive in that spot without any assistance or intervention. Medical experts who examined Lacey's body noted that she had literally grown into the couch. It's possible that the girl had not gotten up from it for so long that her muscles had atrophied and her skin had fused with the surface of the furniture. Lacey's legs were bent under her body in an unnatural position, indicating her immobility for an extended period. At the time of her death, Lacey was wearing only a dirty, tattered t-shirt. She weighed a mere 43 kilograms, which was catastrophically low for an adult woman of her height. Most likely, the girl suffered from severe malnutrition and dehydration, which led to her death. Some sources also reported that the autopsy results revealed the presence of coronavirus in Lacey's body. This was surprising because, according to the testimonies of neighbors and relatives, the only people the girl had contact with in recent years were her own parents. The question arose, could they have been the ones to infect their daughter during the pandemic? When cops began investigating the circumstances of Lacey Fletcher's death, one of the key questions was, what had caused her demise? The answer that investigators received from medical experts was shocking. According to the coroner, Dr. Hasbrook Mims, Lacey had fallen victim to serious medical neglect by her caregivers, her own parents. For years, they had disregarded their daughter's basic needs, leading to a whole range of health problems. Due to chronic malnutrition and acute starvation, Lacey's body was depleted, deprived of vital nutrients. Her muscles had atrophied due to prolonged immobility, resulting in the formation of pressure sores and ulcers on her body. But the most terrifying aspect was that at some point, Lacey developed osteomyelitis, an infectious inflammation of the bone tissue. The pathogens had likely entered her body through open wounds and ulcers. Without proper treatment, the infection spread throughout her body, causing sepsis, a life-threatening reaction of the body to inflammation. Law enforcement also studied information that Lacey might have suffered from locked-in syndrome, also known as pseudocoma. According to some accounts, the girl seemed to be in a state of paralysis, unable to move or speak, although her consciousness was alert. But Dr. Hasbrook Mims refuted these assumptions, noting that apart from the previously diagnosed autism and social phobia, no other neurological disorders were detected in Lacey. It is striking that Lacey's last documented visit to a doctor occurred when she was only 16 years old. Just imagine, 20 years without proper medical supervision, without basic checkups and tests. During this time, any disease could have developed and led to fatal consequences. I cannot comprehend how parents could allow their daughter to end up in such a terrible state. After all, they lived with her under the same roof, saw her every day. Were they so blind or indifferent as to not notice the obvious signs of illness and decline? Of course, one could refer to Lacey's mental state, her social phobia, and reluctance to contact the outside world. But this is no excuse for the parents. It was their duty to provide their daughter with proper care and treatment, even if it meant resorting to coercive measures. In May 2022, after a thorough investigation into the circumstances of Lacey Fletcher's death, her parents, Sheila and Clay, were formally charged with second-degree murder. This was the first step towards justice for the girl who had suffered in silence for so many years. Despite the severity of the crime, they spent only 36 hours behind bars. Imagine, accused of their own daughter's death, they were released on bail of $300,000 each. This amount may seem enormous to the average person, but for a couple who held quite high positions in the local community, it wasn't that much. Of course, releasing suspects on bail is a common practice in our justice system. But in this case, it was difficult to come to terms with the fact that people who had brought their own daughter to such a horrible state could calmly await trial in the comfort of their own home. However, even the highest bail could not soften the shock and outrage that gripped the jurors when they were shown footage from the crime scene and photographs of Lacey's body during the court session. Imagine people's reactions to these chilling images. Some couldn't hold back tears, while others turned away, unable to look at the screen. Even experienced lawyers and law enforcement officers who had seen plenty of brutality in their practice were stunned by the extent of suffering Lacey had endured. This evidence became irrefutable proof of the inhumane conditions in which the girl had lived the last years of her life. The jurors saw with their own eyes the pressure sores and ulcers on her body, the insects and rodents that had infested her bed, the filth and neglect of the room where she had spent her final days. During interrogations, Sheila and Clay Fletcher tried to justify their inaction and negligence in caring for their daughter. They told detectives that Lacey suffered from autism and an extremely severe form of social phobia, which only worsened over the years. According to their account, the girl was terrified of leaving the confines of the house and avoided any contact with the outside world. Allegedly, this was why she stayed in her room around the clock, refusing even to get up from the couch. The Fletchers claimed that the crisis in Lacey's condition occurred when she was a little over 20. The girl had supposedly disappeared, completely entirely isolating herself, losing any desire for communication and activity. She would allegedly scream and throw tantrums when someone tried to persuade her to leave her comfort zone. Clay and Sheila insisted that they had made attempts to help their daughter. They claimed to have tried to lift her from the couch, force her to move, but it only worsened the situation. Lacey would allegedly fall into such severe stress and aggression that the parents were simply afraid to change anything. Particularly cynical were Sheila's words about how Lacey never complained about the precious sores and wounds that festered on her emaciated body. The mother claimed that she regularly examined and treated these ulcers, but the girl allegedly didn't want to be bothered. On the one hand, I understood that raising and caring for a child with such serious mental disorders is indeed a difficult challenge for parents. No one is immune to the possibility of the illness progressing and complicating life for the entire family. But on the other hand, before the investigators sat two adult, educated people who had essentially watched their daughter die in her own home slowly, in agony, in filth and loneliness. I couldn't and didn't want to find excuses for them. Even if Lacey truly refused help and contact, shouldn't the parents have taken more decisive measures? Seek medical assistance, call in specialists, resort to involuntary hospitalization? After all, it was a matter of their own child's life and health. Instead, they watched their daughter's slow agony for years. They watched as she died alive among her own waste. And this was despite the fact that they themselves led quite active social lives, pursued careers and attended church. Throughout the investigation and trial, Sheila and Clay Fletcher tried to justify their inaction by claiming that Lacey was an adult and therefore had the right to make her own decisions about her life. They argued that the girl had consciously chosen to remain confined to the couch, refusing any activity or assistance. According to the parents' version, they simply accepted their daughter's choice and allowed her to exist in this way. They claimed that Lacey had retained mental clarity and the ability to communicate until her last day, which meant she could have changed her situation if she had wanted to. The Fletchers insisted that they suspected nothing, as they had last seen their daughter alive. They allegedly found her dead when they returned home after a weekend trip. But these statements raised serious doubts for me as an investigator. After all, the condition in which Lacey's body was found clearly indicated that the girl had been dying in bed for more than one day, surrounded by filth, parasites, and her own waste. It couldn't have happened suddenly, over a single weekend. The parents were well aware of their daughter's vulnerable mental state, but had not taken any measures for years to provide her with proper care and treatment. They had every opportunity to take Lacey to a doctor, turn to the appropriate services, arrange for hospitalization, or at least hire a caregiver. Instead, they simply left the helpless woman to fend for herself, dooming her to a slow and painful death. And even when the couple allegedly went on vacation, leaving their mentally ill daughter alone in such a pitiful state, it already amounted to criminal negligence. They should have been aware of the risks and responsibilities they carried as guardians of an incapacitated person. The defense tried to touch the jurors with the image of parents supposedly grieving for their prematurely deceased daughter. They hoped that the respected status of the family and the Fletchers' active community involvement would play in their favor. But the prosecution understood that a cruel truth was hidden behind the mask of respectability. And our task was to bring this truth to the court and secure a just punishment. The prosecutor insisted on a thorough investigation of all the circumstances of the case and the appropriate classification of the Fletchers' crime. In our opinion, their actions fell under the article second-degree murder, and should be punished with life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And so, after months of investigation, dozens of witness interrogations, examinations, and fierce court battles, we finally reached the denouement of this chilling story. The jury, having heard all the evidence and arguments of the parties, found Sheila and Clay Fletcher guilty of murdering their daughter Lacey through criminal negligence and inhumane treatment. Witnesses remember the tense silence that fell over the courtroom when the presiding judge announced the verdict. It seemed as if the whole world had frozen in anticipation, and when the words "life imprisonment without the possibility of parole" were uttered, one could hear dozens of people sighing with relief in that silence. Justice had finally prevailed, but the joy of victory was overshadowed by the realization of the full tragedy of the situation. Lacey, an innocent, defenseless girl who suffered from severe illnesses, had become a victim of the cruelty and selfishness of those who should have surrounded her with love and care. She died in agony, in complete loneliness, not understanding why such a fate had befallen her. During the announcement of the verdict, a heavy atmosphere filled with grief reigned in the courtroom. People were not ashamed of their tears, not hiding their shock and indignation. The journalists present seemed to not seek sensational headlines. For the first time in many years, they simply silently honored Lacey's memory. I believe that this story was not in vain. The Lacey Fletcher case shook the entire country, forcing people to think about the problems that had remained in the shadows until now. Community activists and concerned citizens rallied to push for changes in the system of protecting the rights of people with disabilities and mental disorders. Thanks to this tragedy, serious discussions began at the state level about guardianship of incapacitated individuals, the accessibility of medical and social assistance, and monitoring the observance of the rights of vulnerable population groups. And although there is still much work ahead, we have moved from a dead end and taken the first steps towards a more humane and responsible society. I know that the memory of Lacey will live on in the hearts of all who empathize with this tragic story. Radical ideologies often cross the line of common sense, causing their followers to lose touch with reality. It's even worse when the victims of manipulation sincerely begin to believe in the illusions imposed on them. One example of the tragic consequences that blind faith in destructive ideas can lead to occurred in Sweden, a country that has always been considered one of the safest in the world due to its extremely low level of violent crime. In the small Swedish village of Björnberg, on July 27, 1971, a boy named Helge Fossmo was born into a family that was not particularly religious. He became one of 5 children in the family, despite the lack of religious upbringing. At the age of 12, Helge independently became interested in the church and joined a local youth religious group, becoming one of its most active participants. Although his parents did not share their son's enthusiasm, they did not hinder him, believing that it was not the worst occupation for a teenager. According to Helge himself, it was from the moment he joined the church community that his life acquired true meaning, and he found a kind of salvation in faith. For the next 5 years, the young man completely devoted himself to religion, constantly attending church services and participating in various church events. In 1988, fate led Helge to a cafe for Christian youth, where he met his future wife, Helen Johansson. The young couple got married as soon as they came of age and settled in the town of Bordenberg. The couple had 2 children, and Helge continued to delve into religious issues, becoming a preacher in the local community. However, in 1993, a fateful meeting took place that radically changed the life of Helge and his family. The man met Asa Waldau, a charismatic leader of a Christian sect known as the Bride of Christ. Asa came from the tiny town of Knutby, where her teachings originated, with the intention of opening a branch of her church in Bordenberg. Knutby is such a small settlement with a population of about 700 people that there is only 1 store, 1 restaurant, a church, and a few dozen wooden houses scattered among the forest. It would seem that in such a cozy corner, there is no place for evil. But it was here at that time that people lived who later committed 3 horrific murders that overshadowed the crimes of many serial killers in their scale and cruelty. Asa traveled from town to town, preaching her teachings and recruiting new followers, especially among young people. She masterfully manipulated people's minds, urging them to give up everything worldly and devote their lives to serving her church. Helge's family turned out to be an ideal target for the ambitious Bride of Christ. Helge's first meeting with Asa did not go quite smoothly. The devoted Christian expressed doubts that a woman could be a pastor. However, Thanks to her remarkable manipulative abilities, Asa managed to convince the Fosmo family to join her sect, not suspecting what tragic and irreversible consequences this would lead to. Skeptical of Asa's radical views and methods, especially after realizing her affiliation with a sect, Helgi initially rejected the idea of joining the Bride of Christ community. However, the ambitious preacher did not give up. She was interested in attracting the young Fosmo couple to her ranks, so she acted cautiously and methodically. Over the next 4 years, Asa gradually gained the trust of Helgi and Helen, convincing them of the safety of her church's activities. At the same time, she promoted her own teachings, which increasingly captivated Helgi. Eventually, in 1997, the couple agreed not only to join Asa's community, but also to move to the town of Knutby, where her church was located. At first, the move was presented as an ordinary, friendly visit. Asa showed the young family her church from the inside, told them about its activities and goals. Gradually, she increasingly gained the attention of her new followers, criticizing the shortcomings of the traditional church, which eventually sowed a seed of doubt in Helga's mind. A significant part of the residents of Knutby already belonged to Asa's religious community and were involved in various areas of the church's activities. The organization provided work for everyone who wanted it, and almost every member of the community had their own responsibilities, often related to religious service. This brought people together who knew each other well, supported and protected their own. The community gladly accepted the new preacher Helge and his family into their ranks. Having become a pastor of the church in Knutby, Helge quickly drew attention to himself with unconventional motives in his sermons. He often spoke on taboo topics such as sex and death, interpreting them rather dubiously. Despite the fact that not all parishioners shared the radical approach to the interpretation of Scripture, Helge relentlessly pursued his mission. 2 years after the move, the Fosmo family had their 3rd child, which increased the burden on the parents. They decided to hire a nanny, Sarah Svensson, who had recently moved to Knutby, inspired by Asa's teachings. Sarah had grown up in a deeply religious Christian family, but from childhood suffered from severe allergies, which limited her life. The girl was cared for by her mother, with whom she had a very close relationship. But at the age of 11, Sarah lost her mother due to a long illness. This event devastated the girl, turning her into a troubled teenager who often ran away from home. After his wife's death, the entire burden of raising his daughter fell on the father. Despite all his efforts, the man could not fully replace Sarah's mother, although they also had a close bond. The girl stayed with her father until she accidentally met Asa during her travels around the cities in search of new followers. Their acquaintance took place at Bible courses and quickly grew into a close friendship. Sarah turned out to be an ideal candidate for recruitment into the sect. For the experienced manipulator Asa, it was not difficult to discern the girl's vulnerable spots and skillfully use them to lure her into her community. Eventually, Sarah decided to move to Knutby to be closer to the church and comprehend the ways that Asa preached. During this period, Helgi became closer to Asa than ever before. They spent a lot of time together, not only delving into the study of Scripture. This couple claimed to receive divine messages, which they interpreted as prophecies. Helgi diligently wrote down these revelations in his diary, describing in detail the visions, sensations, and their interpretation. One of these records stated that God named Helgi the King of Kings and Asa the Queen of Heaven. According to the pastor, he appeared in the world even at the time of the creation of the world, and since then had been waiting for a meeting with an equal being, Asa. The woman, in turn, insisted that she should marry Helge, because their union would elevate the alternative religion to an incredible height. Both unreservedly believed in these ideas. In 1999, they arranged a kind of sacrament, the wedding ceremony of Helge and Asa. The man gave her a ring with 7 diamonds, because this number has a sacred meaning in many faiths. And all this despite the fact that Helen was still the official wife of the pastor. Of course, such a course of events caused unbearable jealousy on the part of Helen, which led to a rift in her relationship with her husband. Then Asa intervened, She criticized the young wife for jealousy, calling this feeling the most shameful for a true Christian. The sect leader insisted that Helen should change her attitude, otherwise the community would find a way to create serious problems for her, in particular, to take away the house. The intimidated woman was forced to come to terms. The relationship between Helgi and Asa took on an increasingly strange hue. Despite the fact that the pastor was still officially married, he hardly engaged with his family, spending all his time with Asa. This became especially noticeable after their sacrament. The woman constantly showered him with love and praise, attaching him to herself more and more. Asa skillfully used Helgi's devotion not to build a strong relationship or even to separate him from his wife. Her only goal was to establish complete control over the man. Acting insidiously and effectively, she quickly achieved her goal. Helge found himself completely dependent on her. Asa knew everything about him, and sex, which they constantly engaged in, became the most powerful weapon of manipulation. At the same time, the sect leader convinced the pastor that he could literally embody Jesus. All these absurd ideas multiplied like a snowball, and the behavior of Helgi and Asa became more and more outrageous and abnormal. Neither Helen, nor the children, nor other members of the community could influence this situation. Given Asa's manipulative nature, tensions in the Knutby community grew steadily, portending inevitable tragedy. In December 1999, the town was gripped by an epidemic of illness, which did not spare the Fossmo couple. Confined to bed by illness, Helga and Helen were forced to transfer most of the household chores to nanny and housekeeper Sarah Svensson, who miraculously escaped infection. On the morning of December 18th, despite feeling unwell, the couple had breakfast together, after which an exhausted Helgi decided to lie down to rest. Having fallen fast asleep, the man heard a knock at the door through his dream. Upon waking up, he found that his wife was nowhere to be found. It turned out that a concerned neighbor had come to their house, who had not heard any news from the couple all day. Helge assured the neighbor that everything was fine, but he insisted on seeing Helen. The woman did not respond to loud calls, although she definitely had to be at home. Remembering that his wife was going to take a shower, Helgi became worried about her long absence. The men decided to check what had happened. Since Helen did not respond to her name, they had to break the lock with a screwdriver. In the overflowing bathtub, they found the lifeless body of a woman floating face down. The door was locked from the inside, and Helen was still wearing the nightgown she had worn at breakfast. Helgi's eerie scream attracted the attention of several neighbors who ran to the house. Together, they pulled the body out of the water and tried to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but it was too late. 27-year-old Helen was pronounced dead. The autopsy revealed that the deceased woman had a serious head injury that could well have been fatal. The forensic expert suggested several possible causes of death. Obviously, the resulting traumatic brain injury could lead to loss of consciousness and, as a result, drowning of the young mother. Even more questions were raised by the results of a toxicological examination, which revealed an extremely high dose of opioids in the victim's blood. According to calculations, this amount of drugs would be enough to kill Helen, but the woman never took any drugs. Despite all the signs of a possible murder, law enforcement officers classified this case as an accident. They concluded that Helen slipped, fell, and hit her head on the faucet. Sarah Svensson's testimony played an important role in this, confirming every word of the pastor that his wife was alone in the bathroom and no one could kill her. Helgi appeared grief-stricken and sincerely saddened by the loss of his beloved wife. However, those who knew him more closely noticed some strange changes in the behavior of the widower. In particular, he almost immediately got rid of all the things associated with Helen and never mentioned her again, even forbidding the children to talk about their mother. Some suspected that Helen's death was not an accident, but that the unwanted wife was simply gotten rid of so that she would not interfere with ambitious plans. In addition, it became known that the man personally influenced the conclusion of the forensic medical examination. At first, Helgi, citing religious beliefs, demanded that an autopsy not be performed at all, but he was refused due to the suspicious circumstances of the death. Then the preacher insisted on removing information about the presence of opioids in the blood of the deceased from the conclusion. He explained his demand by the desire to minimize the likelihood that his wife could have committed suicide, because it is a sin because of which her soul will not go to heaven. With these dubious actions, Helge allegedly sought to protect Helen's memory and the reputation of his family from shame. Suddenly, during this period, Asa lost interest in Helge. Their stormy romance was cut short when she once again went on a pilgrimage and decided not to return. Unfortunately, the charismatic leader managed to thoroughly brainwash the pastor, who was filled with determination to continue on the path of the sect. Despite the ostentatious grief and tears, Helge very quickly found a new love in the person of Asa's sister, Alexandra Waldau. The relationship between the lovers developed rapidly, greatly facilitated by Helge's high status. At that time, many considered him a person close to God, so they treated him with great respect, which also bribed Alexandra. Already in the spring of 2000, she moved into the pastor's house and soon they got married. However, even a new marriage did not curb Helge's sexual appetites. One woman was always not enough for him, so already in the spring of 2001, he began to actively court the nanny of his children, Sarah Svensson, who still worked in his house. The girl readily accepted signs of attention from such a respected man. Their relationship even received a blessing from the sect leader Asa Waldau. By the time these events unfolded, Helge's relationship with Alexandra had deteriorated. Nanny Sarah, who became the pastor's lover, tried to support him in solving family problems. Helge cynically took advantage of the girl's sympathy, often inviting her to pray together in the church. During these prayer meetings, the man often inclined Sarah to intimacy, insisting that this had nothing to do with satisfying carnal desires, but was a kind of spiritual union and a message to God. So strong was Sarah's belief in Helge's righteousness that she willingly believed these stories and even felt some kind of divine inspiration at such moments. The girl sincerely believed that she was doing a godly deed, although in fact she fell into the trap of a skilled manipulator who covered himself with spiritual values, having goals far from religion. Shortly after the beginning of this relationship, Helge began to voice increasingly contradictory statements. At first, he declared that the Lord was waging his battles on earth, and the pastor himself was his warrior. According to Helge, this mission was not easy, because sometimes it was necessary to remove various obstacles along the way. The man spoke in riddles, and the naive Sarah, who perceived her lover's sermons as divine revelations, willingly believed everything. In fact, Helge was gradually probing the ground for the implementation of his insidious plan. Later, the pastor began to tell that during sex, God sends him important messages about the fate of his second wife, Alexandra. Helge interpreted these signs as a portent of her imminent death. Brainwashing Sarah, he claimed that the Lord had shown him the ideal life companion, herself, the nanny. Moreover, Helge intimidated the girl by saying that he himself could die if his marriage to Alexandra was not dissolved. Although during this period their union was falling apart at the seams, the pastor could not get a divorce due to strict church rules. Like all the women in Helge's entourage, Sarah was enchanted by his stories. With these bizarre messages, he gradually led the nanny of his children to commit a terrible act. The skilled manipulator managed to firmly tie the victim to himself, using his authority in the church and knowledge of Sarah's vulnerabilities. Helge adopted many techniques of such control from Asa, and now willingly put them into practice. At that time, many people seriously considered the pastor to be the person closest to God, so it was not difficult for him to persuade the nanny to his side. According to Helge, the girl had to help the Almighty in the battle with demons, for which she needed to move in with him, despite the fact that he was still living with Alexandra. The women lived in different rooms, and Helge had sex with both of them every night in turn, each time justifying it as a fight against evil spirits. The pastor called intimate relationships a ritual of purification from defilement. His eloquence allowed him to convince his mistresses that he was a messenger of heaven, and in this way opposed the enemies of the Lord. These peculiar three-way relationships lasted until 2003, although Helgi already wanted to get rid of Alexandra, with whom he allegedly broke up, but could not officially divorce. During this period, the manipulation of Sarah reached its apogee. For the most part, Helgi turned to her only for sex, and the rest of the time he insulted her, calling her a sinner and an arrogant blonde. But each time he ended the emotional torture with the phrase, "I love you." The girl was so happy with these three words that she stopped paying attention to all the insults. She was willing to do anything to earn the favor of the chosen one of God, a fighter against demons, not even noticing how, along with this, she was losing her own will, turning into a puppet in the hands of a dangerous man. Against the backdrop of problems with his second wife, Helgi repeatedly asked his mistress if she was ready to kill in the name of the Lord. If earlier Sarah hesitated with the answer, now, it seemed, she reacted more calmly, and the pastor felt that he would soon be able to persuade her to do it. The girl replied that she was not ready, but resisted much weaker than before. Then, to push Sarah on the true path, Helgi created a new account in the messenger and began sending her messages from an unknown number, trying to convince her that it was God himself who wanted to contact her. In these creepy correspondences, the girl was told that she had little time left and she had to kill in the name of the Lord no later than November 25th. When Sarah suspected that Helga was behind these messages, he angrily denied his involvement, once again shaming his mistress, accusing her of a lack of faith and sinfulness. Unfortunately, it worked as it had before. Afterward, the pastor began sending Sarah messages that she should become part of the divine plan, sending human souls to heaven. This alleged God claimed that for her, this was the only way to salvation. Helga's manipulations and intimidation led Sarah to begin to fear for her soul and dare to commit a crime. On November 8th, 2003, she broke into the pastor's house and attacked his wife Alexandra, who was sleeping in her bed. Sarah hit her with a hammer, but the woman miraculously managed to survive and fight off the attacker. The reason for the attack was a message that Sarah allegedly received from God via messenger. It contained an order to immediately kill the preacher's wife. Oddly enough, the criminal escaped punishment, probably due to Helga's insistence not to report the incident to the police. Indeed, no record of this event was found in the law enforcement database. Instead of punishment, the pastor expelled his former mistress to live with her own father. However, this did not affect Sarah's correspondence with God in any way, which only fueled her terrifying confidence in the need to kill. Shortly after these events, Helga found a new passion, a neighbor, Annette Lind, who at that time was married to a man named Daniel. Having decided to get rid of a competitor, the preacher began sending messages to Sarah, manipulating her in the same way as before. The frightened girl, seeking salvation, again agreed to take up arms. This time, Sarah prepared more thoroughly. She bought a pistol and even researched on the internet how to make a homemade silencer. Following the instructions of the Almighty, she hoped for success and the liberation of her soul. On January 10th, 2004, at 3:30 in the morning, Sarah, keeping in touch with Helga, drove up in her father's car to the area where the pastor lived. Having parked 500 meters from the house, the killer put on a black mask and put on shoes of different sizes to throw the police off the trail. Entering through the unlocked door, the lock of which the organizer of the crime broke in advance, staging a robbery, Sarah crept into the room of 23-year-old Alexandra, who was sleeping soundly. Having shot first in the thigh and then, when the victim woke up and screamed, in the head, the criminal killed the woman. At 4:30 in the morning, Sarah went to the house of the second victim, Daniel, the husband of Helga's new mistress. The pastor knew that the man was left alone that night and told Sarah about it. The doors were locked, so the girl just knocked. When 30-year-old Daniel opened the door, she shot him in the chest without hesitation, and when he fell, once more in the head. Fleeing from the crime scene, Sarah did not suspect that the second victim had survived, Daniel managed to get to the phone and call for help. Arriving at the call, the police found him conscious, so he was able to describe the attacker. At that moment, 32-year-old Helgi was already at the crime scene, allegedly trying to help his neighbor. Helgi accompanied the wounded Daniel to the hospital, where he learned about the murder of his wife Alexandra. The pastor again began to play the role of a grief-stricken husband. The description of the attacker provided by Daniel was rather confusing due to the mask on her face. Gradually, attention focused on Helgi and Sarah. One of the neighbors, whose brains had not yet been washed, recalled similar strange circumstances of the death of the pastor's first wife. Information also surfaced about the hammer attack on Alexandra, during which she nearly died at the hands of Sarah. The bloody fingerprints found at the scene of Alexandra's murder and on the door of Daniel's house became irrefutable proof of the 26-year-old nanny's guilt. Sarah was immediately arrested. At first, she insisted that she acted independently, without anyone's prompting, and then began to claim that she committed crimes in the name of God. During a search of Sarah, a phone was seized, where Helga's number and another unknown subscriber were found. Although no correspondence with the Almighty was found on this device, the detectives came across a call from Sarah's old number. Thorough searches of her house revealed another mobile phone, which stored more than 1,000 text messages with God. These messages contained intrusive manipulation and incitement to murder. After tracking the unknown number, the investigation led to the pastor of the local church. Learning about this, the disappointed Sarah, who sincerely believed in the divine origin of the correspondence, told the police the whole truth. The wounded Daniel's wife, Annette Lind, was also suspected of complicity and arrested, but 2 weeks later, she was released without charge. During the trial, the arrogant Helge denied his involvement and showed no remorse. A psychiatric examination found him sane. The scale of the manipulations was staggering. Having sufficient evidence, the prosecutor's office proved Helge's guilt in inciting the murder of Alexandra and the attempt on Daniel's life. In July 2004, the pastor was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to parole after 24 years. Despite several appeals that were rejected, Helge will only have a chance for early release in 2028. He was also accused of involvement in the death of his first wife, but was acquitted due to lack of evidence, although the prosecutor is convinced of his guilt. In 2007, while in prison, Helge married for the third time. The identity of his new wife remains unknown. During an interview in August 2006, the imprisoned pastor admitted his involvement in the murder of Alexandra and the attack on Daniel, claiming that several other people were involved in organizing the crimes. However, the case was never reopened. Currently, Helge Fossmo is serving his sentence in the maximum security prison Tidaholm in Sweden. At the trial, a video was shown with a reconstruction of the crime, where Sarah spoke in detail about what she had done. A private investigation revealed that the court was shown an edited version, while the original 6-hour recording contained discrepancies with the actual details of the crime. In interviews with journalists, Sarah adhered to the false reconstruction of events. This raised doubts about the true course of events and the identity of the main culprit. It was assumed that the murderer could be the pastor himself, who shifted the responsibility to Sarah. Sarah Svensson, recognized as insane, was placed in a psychiatric hospital. In 2011, after completing treatment, she was released, as doctors considered her safe for society. In 2020, sect leader Asa Waldau was convicted on 8 counts of assaulting former parishioners and sentenced to community service. The woman changed her last name, moved, and withdrew from church affairs. Thanks to the efforts of doctors, Daniel survived the attack but refused to return to the city, fearing the local church and sectarians. Another pastor of the same church, Urban Feld, was convicted of sexual exploitation of persons dependent on him. Several women from the community whom he called his daughters and manipulated. The moral of this chilling story is that blind faith and fanaticism can lead to terrible consequences, especially when manipulated by ruthless and charismatic individuals. The tragedy in Knutby demonstrates how religious beliefs, taken to extremes, can cloud the mind and push people to the most terrible acts. The main tragedy of this story was not only the murder of Alexandra and the attempt on Daniel's life, but also the ruined lives of all those who fell under the pernicious influence of Pastor Helge Fossmo. Sarah Svensson suffered the most, a young girl who, due to naivety and gullibility, became a toy in the hands of an experienced manipulator. Her sincere faith was cynically used to achieve selfish goals, which led to irreparable consequences. To protect yourself from such situations, it is necessary to always maintain critical thinking and not allow anyone to manipulate your consciousness, even if it is a spiritual leader. You cannot blindly trust authorities and follow instructions that are contrary to morality and common sense. Faith should be a conscious choice, not an instrument of control in the hands of other people. It is important to remember that true religion brings love, mercy, and forgiveness, not hatred, condemnation, and violence. A young Italian woman, Veronica Panarello, faced numerous challenges in her life. At the age of 16, she met Davide Stival at a bar, who immediately caught her eye, and she quickly opened up to him. Despite the 4-year age difference, the couple conversed as if they had known each other for a long time. Despite the girl's youth, they started a relationship. Within 3 months, Veronica was already begging to start a family. The girl had no doubts. She wanted a child from David. He agreed and they moved in together. Soon, Veronica became pregnant. In 2006, when she was only 17 and he was 21, their son Loris was born. It was then that Veronica's family began to experience problems. Constant conflicts with her parents and the desire to run away from home intensified with the birth of the out-of-wedlock child. However, the young girl created a semblance of a family, contrary to the expectations of her elders. To the surprise of their relatives, the young couple's affairs were going quite well. Terrible trials lay ahead. But for now, Veronica tried to give her son everything he needed. Over time, the couple officially legalized their marriage. The young mother became pregnant again and gave birth to a second boy, whom they named Diego. Veronica essentially remained under the care of her parents. Although Davide worked, his efforts were not enough to provide for his wife and 2 children. The parents from both sides supported the couple in every possible way, primarily financially. Veronica, on the other hand, did not even think about looking for a job, having completely devoted herself to the children and the household. Her husband considered her an exemplary, industrious, neat, and loving wife. The children grew up, having genuinely warm relationships with their mother. She spent all her free time with them, although sometimes it resembled more of a friendship between peers. Probably because of the too early age of motherhood, there is an opinion that Veronica was still in a rebellious mood, which is why conflicts with her parents escalated. The elders believed that she would not become a full-fledged mother if she perceived everything as a game. But any attempts to get through to her ended in hysterics. The couple lived in a rural area with a population of 10,000 inhabitants, the town of Santa Croce Camarina in southern Italian Sicily, where everyone knew each other. For such a cozy corner, such early motherhood seemed strange. However, no one suspected that this reckless, youthful haste would lead to the terrible tragedy that we will tell you about. On November 29, 2014, at noon, Veronica Panarello appeared at the police station. The 25-year-old woman reported the disappearance of her 8-year-old son Loris. According to her, in the morning, as always, she had brought the boy to school. He went inside with the other students. Then she took her younger son to kindergarten. Loris was supposed to be at school until 12:30. When the woman came to pick him up, her son was nowhere to be found. The mother became alarmed and could not find him. Immediately after that, Veronica decided to go to the police and write a statement about the disappearance of the 8-year-old boy. Law enforcement officers immediately contacted the school, but no teacher or employee had seen Loris that day. The students also confirmed that they had not met him either near the school or in class. Some thought that the boy was skipping classes. Others assumed that he could have been kidnapped. However, no one believed that Loris would voluntarily get into an unfamiliar car. He was too smart for that. So the question arose, how could he have ended up on the street if his mother had taken him to the school door and saw him go inside? At that time, her 29-year-old husband, Davide Stival, was working as a driver and was on a trip in Rome. The Carabinieri immediately called him, and the man was shocked by the news. It turned out that his wife had not even informed him. Then he called Veronica himself, and she confirmed Loris's disappearance. David immediately got on a plane to get to the city as quickly as possible. As soon as he landed, he saw a post on his wife's social media with a photo of her and their son. It was an announcement that the boy had been found dead. Loris's body was found 4 hours after the police report. It had been thrown into a ditch near an old mill. The place was just minutes away from the couple's house by car. It was accidentally discovered by an elderly man who was hunting in the area. During his usual walk through the forest, he noticed something suspicious in the mud. As he approached, the witness realized that it was not just a discarded object, but the body of a child. The man immediately informed the police about the discovery. At the scene, criminologists found the child's mutilated body, unnaturally twisted in the ditch, with his pants pulled down and no underwear. Law enforcement officers immediately suspected a sexual motive for the crime. Investigators believed that they were dealing with a child molester. However, unlike typical perverts, he not only raped his victims, but also killed them. This made the criminal twice as dangerous. News of the tragedy quickly spread through the town, sowing panic among the inhabitants. The realization that every child could become a target of a predator instilled fear and forced people to change their usual way of life. The news of the murder in the small village instantly flew around all of Italy. The country's central TV channels talked about the victim. This event became one of the loudest newsworthy events of 2014, stirring up the public. Society demanded that the police catch the criminal as soon as possible and bring him to justice. Meanwhile, detectives, working tirelessly, searched for the monster capable of such an act to calm the community. The investigators working on the case immediately noticed some strange details. The crime was clearly not committed according to the classic scheme characteristic of typical rapists and maniacs. The strangest thing was not even the absence of the child's underwear. After removing it, the criminal put the pants back on the body. Such abusers do indeed often collect the victim's belongings, but they almost never put the clothes back on after taking the trophy. Moreover, no similar cases had been observed in this area before. The police turned their attention to the family of the deceased. Veronica and Davide were decent people. Everyone knew them as a loving young family. Despite the fact that the child was born when the mother was a minor, now she had become an adult woman and really gave the impression of a devoted mother. In any case, under such circumstances, the most valuable information can be provided by the family itself. So the investigators came to talk to the parents of the murdered boy. Here, the police found out that Davide spent very little time at home. Due to his work as a driver, he was with his family for no more than 50 days a month. Almost all the free time, the children were with their mother. Thus, the young woman was constantly left alone, without a husband. It was not easy for her to cope with household chores and raising children on her own. The woman often complained about the difficulties. Against the background of her loneliness, rumors about lovers spread through the town. However, during the check, it was not possible to confirm this information. At the Stival family's house, the police found Veronica. According to Davide, this tragedy had destroyed her. The young mother was constantly crying and refusing to eat. Subsequently, this led to exhaustion. The young woman was taken to the hospital, where she had to be given special IV drips with a nutritious solution so that she would not die. The police saw her during this period. She really looked bad. Veronica was emotionally broken. It even manifested physically. Huge dark circles formed under her eyes and her skin took on an unhealthy pallor. During this period, Loris's younger brother Diego was still living with the family. However, later, the parents took him to his grandparents, as the mother was in an unstable mental state. She did not take care not only of herself, but also ignored the needs of the child. The husband supported his wife all this time and was forced to quit his job. Despite the difficulty with which the Stiefel family was experiencing the loss of a child, the investigators decided to bring both parents to the place where Loris's body was found. The police made video recordings. They believed that this trip could provide useful data. In the video, you can see not even Veronica, but literally the shadow of a person. So hard was she experiencing the loss of her son. Horatio Fedone got on the list of suspects. He was the same elderly hunter who discovered the child's body. The detectives suspected him because the man had led them to the victim, just 4 hours after the boy was declared missing. Of course, it could have been a coincidence, but it was worth making sure how the man managed to find the deceased so quickly. The investigators launched a large-scale check but could not find a connection between the hunter and the evidence. He successfully passed a polygraph test, had a confirmed alibi for the morning of Loris's disappearance, and his fingerprints and DNA were not found on the boy's body. However, the heightened interest in Horatio Fedone led to local residents starting to accuse Veronica of having an intimate relationship with his grandson, and even with him. In the end, after rather harsh checks, all suspicions were removed from Horatio. The detectives were convinced that Horatio had indeed accidentally stumbled upon the boy. He had the misfortune to be in that place just a few hours after Loris was declared missing. At the same time, the investigation ran out of assumptions and leads. No traces indicating the perpetrator could be found, so it was decided to call in reinforcements of Carabinieri from Rome to join the investigation. The new participants in the case, having studied all the materials, believed that the mother was involved in the disappearance of her son. They immediately drew attention to the problems in the relationship between Veronica and her relatives. The grandparents told the investigators that the deceased boy had told them about a strange experiment at school. According to the child, his mother had bought plastic zip ties needed for classes. The boy talked about this literally the day before his disappearance. This seemed suspicious because zip ties are quite a dangerous object and are prohibited from being used in school. When the detectives asked the teachers about this experiment, it turned out that they really had not planned anything like that and would not have needed any cable ties. Eventually, the investigators decided that the child had made them up. But after receiving the report from the forensic experts, the investigators remembered these items. According to the specialists who performed the autopsy, the time of the child's death fell between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning on the day he disappeared. The cause of the boy's death was strangulation by some foreign object of small thickness, tightened around his neck. It looks very much like he was strangled with cable ties. Then the investigators suggested that there might be a connection between these two facts. The forensic expert believed that the murder was committed somewhere near the place where the body was found, since the injuries from the fall were received almost immediately after death, or he was thrown out while still alive and died a little later. The detectives assumed that the child could really, for some reason, have wanted to get these ties and made up a story about their need at school. Then Loris would have had to carry them in his backpack when he went to class. But how could the attacker have known about this? It raised great doubts that the killer attacked the boy, grabbed his backpack, and began to look for a murder weapon there. The Carabinieri considered it necessary to find the blue backpack, believing that it would give new clues. To do this, they blocked all the landfills where waste was brought from Santa Croce Camarina. In the end, it took the police several days to examine the dumps, but they never managed to find the boy's blue backpack. In addition to information about strangulation, the forensic medical examination made it possible to find out another strange circumstance. Despite the absence of underwear and the lowered pants, no signs of sexual violence or traces of the DNA of the probable pervert were found. From that moment on, the police had doubts about the previous version of events. They were still looking for the criminal, but already understood that this was not a typical maniac or molester. It no longer seemed that the crime was committed on sexual grounds. It was necessary to compile a full psychological profile of the killer. However, at this stage of the investigation, the information turned out to be too confusing, and it was problematic to do this. the solution suggested itself. The detectives decided to trace the path that the mother and child were moving on the day of the massacre. Despite the fact that it was a very small provincial town, Veronica and Loris were moving along the central street, where many houses had surveillance cameras installed. Of course, it took a lot of time to collect and view the recordings. It is clear that law enforcement officers tried to notice a third person following a woman with her son in a black Volkswagen Polo. Perhaps a suspicious car was following them. However, no matter how hard the investigators tried, they could not notice anything unusual that would be of interest to them. However, quite quickly, the detectives drew attention to several strange things. Firstly, they never managed to see the moment when the boy enters the school, although the mother continued to insist that she allegedly took him almost to the threshold of the educational institution. It became clear that Veronica was lying, and they did not reach the school that morning. After viewing dozens of hours of recordings, the investigators saw that only the younger child got out of the car near the kindergarten. The detectives continued to analyze the camera recordings from the entire district in search of clues. So they saw how at one of the intersections that Veronica was supposed to pass, she turned towards the church, not far from which the victim was later found. This seemed strange because for many years before that, she had used a different road. What could have forced the young mother to change her preferences on the very day when her son was found dead? This aroused certain suspicions among the Carabinieri. At this stage, the police officers decided not to disclose the discovered information so as not to startle Veronica, but began to consider the young woman as a suspect. Experienced policemen decided to immediately check the veracity of her words. To do this, Veronica was asked to drive with the investigators along the same route that she used on the day of the child's death so that she could show everything personally. They already knew the route as they had managed to completely restore it with the help of recordings from video surveillance cameras. The woman agreed, and they began to conduct a reconstruction of events. When the police car, together with Veronica, drove up to that decisive intersection where she changed her preferences, the woman lied. The detectives investigating the murder of 8-year-old Loris Stivel began to suspect his mother, Veronica Panarello, after discovering that she had lied about her route on the morning her son disappeared. During the investigative experiment, the woman indicated that she was moving along the usual path, although the surveillance camera recordings showed otherwise. The police decided to search the Stivel family's house and interrogate Veronica at the station. The young mother was outraged to learn that she was considered a likely killer of her own child. She insisted on her innocence, stating that under no circumstances would she have harmed her son. However, the investigators had reason to think otherwise. During the hours-long interrogation, Veronica admitted that she had dropped off her elder son Loris half a kilometer from the school that morning because she was in a hurry. According to her, someone could have attacked the boy on the way. The woman also denied being near the ravines where her son's body was found, assuring that she was not at all familiar with that area. However, the suspect's sister refuted these statements, saying that in childhood they often visited there and knew those places well. Veronica's presence in the crime area was also confirmed by surveillance camera recordings. David Stival, the father of the deceased boy, at first could not believe in his wife's involvement in the murder of their son. After viewing the video recordings, he recognized Veronica and the children, who left the house in the morning. But instead of taking Loris to school, the woman turned him back home. He was no longer visible on the recordings. Then Veronica took the younger child to the kindergarten and returned. Contrary to her habit, she drove into the garage in reverse, rather than leaving the car in front of the house. According to the investigators, it was at this time between 9 and 10 in the morning that the crime occurred. Loris was not at school and stayed at home, and when his mother drove into the garage, she was doing something out of the camera's view. Despite all the evidence, Veronica continued to deny her guilt, insisting that she had taken her elder son to school and her younger son to kindergarten, after which she returned home. She suggested that Loris could have been kidnapped right outside the school. But the police did not believe this, because they saw on the video how at 9:23 Veronica left the house again, and just 2 minutes later she was heading towards the old mill, where her son's body was soon found. Returning home at 9:38, she was definitely alone. Given the speed of events, the boy most likely was no longer breathing when he was thrown into the ditch. At 9:41, Veronica was already on her way to her usual cooking classes. She left early to arrive by the start of classes at 10 in the morning and not arouse suspicion. There, no one noticed any changes in her behavior. GPS data from Veronica's phone and car confirmed her movements established by the investigators. Unfortunately, the collected evidence was not yet sufficient for an official accusation, so the young mother was simply placed under arrest, and law enforcement officers continued to search for irrefutable evidence. At some point, it seemed that the suspect was about to be exposed, but suddenly, a policewoman who was on duty near the school turned to the station. She claimed that she had seen Veronica dropping Loris off at the educational institution on the day of the murder. However, the investigators did not trust these statements too much because they contradicted the video recordings. The policewoman could have simply confused the days since Veronica performed the same actions every morning. Meanwhile, the main suspect was behind bars, desperately proving her innocence. But the seeds of doubt had already been sown. When the carabinieri told David about the discrepancies in his wife's route, he also acknowledged her behavior as suspicious and sided with the investigation. The police saw this as an opportune moment to obtain a confession. They understood that the suspect most likely trusted her husband, so they decided to arrange a meeting between them, during which Davide would try to elicit some new details from his wife. After all, Veronica was the only person who had complete information about the events of that tragic morning. David agreed that it was a good idea, but noted that he did not seek his wife's conviction. 1 month after the brutal murder of 8-year-old Loris Stivel, on January 6, 2015, his father David came to meet with his arrested wife Veronica. Despite the fact that according to Italian law he had no right to be in prison, the police made an exception, hoping that it would help solve the crime. Veronica didn't even greet her husband, but immediately asked if he had a microphone for eavesdropping. Davide denied it and proved the absence of any recording devices. In fact, they were not needed because the meeting was being filmed by a prison surveillance camera. The suspect continued to insist on her innocence and version of events. She incessantly repeated to everyone, the police, the lawyer, her husband, relatives who visited her in prison, that she had taken her son to school and did not know what had happened to him next. The detectives could not prove the mother's involvement in the massacre. Even the motive itself raised doubts. Everyone who knew Veronica characterized her as a decent woman who sincerely loved her sons. Of course, there were various rumors, but the investigators checked every word and found no confirmation of the gossip. Veronica was indeed a caring mother. The only lead that seemed plausible to the detectives to explain the crime could be depression or emotional instability. The main suspect was indeed in a very depressed state, which only worsened due to her imprisonment. The investigation had reached a dead end, and it occurred to the investigators to allow the mother to visit the child's grave to say goodbye to him. Veronica was taken to the cemetery, accompanied by a whole motorcade of 10 cars with flashing lights on. It seemed as if a dangerous maniac was being transported through the city. A listening device was installed on the tombstone, of course. The officers were sure that by leaving the mother alone with her deceased son, they would hear an apology or a confession of murder. And Veronica started talking. But these were not at all the words that the police expected to hear. She was sobbing, praying, and swearing that she knew her boy's killer and would punish him. This came as a complete surprise to the carabinieri. Later, she was put in a car to be taken back to her cell. On the way, the young mother suddenly reported that at her son's grave she had some kind of insight. She admitted that she had begun to recall the events of that fatal day, which had previously eluded her memory. However, Veronica was not going to share this with the detectives. Instead, she expressed a desire to meet with her husband again. On November 6, 2015, David visited Veronica again. Of course, like all visits behind prison walls, this meeting was also recorded. This time, the main suspect admitted for the first time that she thought she had not taken the child to school at all on the day of his disappearance. The woman complained about difficulties in expressing her thoughts as she found herself in an unusual state. According to Veronica, that morning she seemed to have fallen out of reality, and everything around her seemed shrouded in fog. From her fragmentary memories, she was able to recreate how she took her younger son to kindergarten and then returned home, where Loris was supposed to be. She left her elder son at home because he did not want to go to school. But when she returned, Veronica did not find the boy. Being in a strange state, she thought that she had already taken him to school, but realized her mistake when she came to pick up the child from school, and he was not there. The police, of course, did not believe the new version, but were convinced that they were moving in the right direction. It almost resembled the very confession they had needed for a whole year to bring the killer to justice. They considered her excuse of memory loss an attempt to mitigate her guilt and get a shorter sentence than she deserved. However, not everyone shared this point of view, since the woman's condition really caused concern. Unfortunately, the younger son was still too young and could not testify to the police about whether he had seen his brother that day. Despite their confidence in Veronica's involvement in the murder, the Carabinieri decided to meet her halfway and suggested going home in the hope that it would help unlock new memories. She was led through the rooms, which remained unchanged from the day of the boy's death. When the main suspect entered Loris's room, something theatrical began to happen. She started speaking in her son's voice and reproducing the dialogues that she allegedly had with him that morning. The detectives saw how emotionlessly she was doing it, and at that moment they became convinced that before them was a true pathological liar and manipulator who was once again trying to lead the investigation away from the truth. But could she, being in her right mind, have been deceiving everyone for more than a year? During this time, dozens of specialists had spoken with the suspect. Despite the fact that the police officers were not sure about the reliability of the new version of events told by the young mother, many still believe in it to this day. According to Veronica, after returning home from the kindergarten, she started washing baby bottles. Her elder son, Loris, did not want to go to school, so the woman allowed him to spend the whole day at home. While the mother was doing household chores, the boy was in his room. Veronica did not hear anything suspicious, but when she entered her son's room sometime later, she saw his blue body with cable ties tightened around his neck. The child had probably been playing with them and tried to tighten them around his neck. The ties were connected to each other like a necklace. As the woman recounted, her son froze with frightened eyes. He was pulling on one of the ends of the ties, thinking that this way he would be able to open them, but in fact, he was only tightening the deadly trap even more. The mother knew how they worked, but realized that she would not be able to tear them apart with her hands, so she ran to the kitchen for scissors. When the story's heroine returned and cut the fatal ribbon, the boy was no longer showing signs of life. He had lost consciousness and was not breathing. According to Veronica's confession, she had a panic attack. She immediately took her cell phone and tried to dial the emergency service number. However, she was shaking so much that she simply could not dial the number. Her fingers were missing the buttons, and the numbers were blurring before her eyes. After all this, Veronica realized that she would be the one blamed for what had happened. Being in an inadequate state, she decided to get rid of her son's body. Later, the forensic medical examination confirmed the presence of scratches on the child's face and neck. They resembled real attempts to tear off the cable ties from him with fingernails. Unfortunately, the ties had cut too deep into the skin, so it was impossible to tear them off with hands. According to the investigators, in a panic, the mother could have pulled on one of the ends of the ties herself, which further aggravated the situation and finally cut off the access to oxygen. At this stage, the police decided to clarify the information and, if possible, awaken new memories, so Veronica and Davide were again taken to the place where Loris was found. Here, the mother admitted that she had indeed thrown the child into the ravine, but continued to deny that she had dealt with him herself. she still could not explain why the boy had no underwear. This circumstance did not fit into her story in any way. It also raised great doubts as to why an 8-year-old intelligent child would put these ties around his neck, tighten them more and more, and not even call for help. Later, the suspect recalled that the ravine turned out to be too deep, so the pants accidentally slipped off the body, and it twisted as the boy rolled to the bottom. At the trial, the prosecution tried to refute the mother's confession. Her uncharacteristic behavior was the most alarming. Veronica parked the car in the garage in a very unusual way, so that it was really convenient to load the body unnoticed. However, this happened at a moment when she could not yet have known about her son's death. According to her confession, he died later. In the opinion of the prosecution, this indicated the intentional nature of the murder. The defense continued to insist that the mother did not kill the child, but that he himself died due to negligence. Realizing the severity of what had happened, Veronica simply got scared. The woman was in a state of shock, so she took the body out and threw it away. However, she could not answer one of the key questions. The prosecution could not understand why she took the underwear off the boy and then put his pants back on. According to Veronica, she simply did not remember this. The prosecutor considered her actions an attempt to stage an attack on the boy by a rape in order to lead the investigation along the wrong path. Initially, her plan worked, and the police were looking for such a criminal. But later they realized that it was part of the staging. During the trial of this case, an unexpected plot twist emerged. Veronica admitted that Loris was killed by the boy's grandfather on his father's side, named Andrea Stiefel. She allegedly had an affair with her husband's father. That day, the child caught them having sex and began to threaten that he would tell his father everything. Andrea Stiefel, the boy's paternal grandfather, allegedly attacked his grandson in a fit of anger and strangled him. Despite this strange turn of events, law enforcement officers were forced to check the accused's statement. They turned to the surveillance camera recordings again. Thus, the investigators found out that none of the men had entered the house that morning. However, in the footage where Veronica was leaving the house around 9:30, a dark silhouette was indeed visible in the back seat of the car. The Carabinieri were forced to involve specialists for the analysis of the video recordings, but they claimed that it was not the shadow of a person, but glare on the car windows. Andrea Stiefel himself denied both the connection with his son's wife and the murder of his grandson. He stated that this was another lie of a crazy woman. The grandfather had a confirmed alibi. In addition, there was no correspondence or even calls between the so-called lovers, which also refuted Veronica's words. Therefore, no one believed this new version of the defendant. Veronica's behavior suggested that the investigation was dealing with a person with mental disorders. Her strange behavior was emphasized by all the officers and specialists who communicated with her. One of the detectives recalled that during one of the interrogations, the woman suddenly began to sing, and also repeatedly her calm and loud speech changed to an indistinct mumbling under her breath with a blank look. Veronica seemed to periodically fall out of reality and could start smoking an imaginary cigarette. The defendant's mother said that Veronica had previously had mental problems. From an early age, she was repeatedly sexually abused by boys. At the age of 14, the girl tried to take her own life by drinking bleach after a quarrel with her school friends. The following year, she tried to hang herself in a greenhouse. Veronica underwent treatment in a psychiatric clinic. Once she called her mother and asked her to pick her up because the paramedic had allegedly ricked her. But these accusations did not receive any confirmation, and no one believed the girl. A psychiatric examination showed that Veronica acted in a cold-blooded, prudent, and cruel manner. No serious mental disorders were found in her that would allow her to be declared insane. The trial lasted a whole 4 years due to constant postponements and additional investigations. Based on the results of the trial, she was found guilty of premeditated murder and concealment of the body. The judge sentenced her to 30 years in prison. After that, another performance took place. Obviously, the child's grandfather, whom Veronica referred to as the criminal, was in the courtroom. The defendant did not agree with the verdict, So she stood up and again began to accuse the man of all those absurd things that she had already voiced earlier in court. She was removed from the courtroom and sent behind bars. Veronica is still in prison, keeping the terrible truth of the death of the 8-year-old boy, which we will probably never know. However, most of the investigators who worked on this case believe that it was not an accident, but a planned, brutal murder. Probably, on that day, the son did not want to go to school. This had happened before. It was not the first case of him skipping. On this basis, the mother quarreled with her son and strangled him with ties in a fit of anger, and then got rid of the body, deliberately removed his underwear to confuse the investigation. But since the ties were purchased in advance, perhaps it all looked even more ominous and indicated the planning of the murder. The boy's father stated after the trial that his life was destroyed because he had simultaneously lost his son, wife, and job. The man is still not sure that it was Veronica who killed the boy. He did not understand what could have been the reason for killing his son. David had never seen his wife display violence towards the children. She had always been a caring mother. Now he is trying to live for the sake of his younger son, in whose upbringing his parents are helping him. The story of Veronica Panarello and her son Loris is a tragic tale of how impulsive decisions, lack of maturity, and emotional instability can lead to devastating consequences. This case serves as a cautionary tale for all parents about the importance of responsible parenting and the need to overcome one's own psychological issues for the safety and well-being of their family. The main cause of this tragedy was Veronica's inability to cope with the challenges of motherhood at such a young age. Her emotional immaturity, possible mental disorders, and lack of proper support from loved ones created a dangerous combination of factors that ultimately led to the child's death. To prevent such tragedies, it is crucial that young parents have access to the resources and support necessary for raising children. This includes parenting education, emotional support, counseling, and assistance in case of psychological issues. Society as a whole should pay more attention to the mental health and well-being of families, especially those facing additional challenges such as early and unplanned pregnancies. Meet the Duane twins, Allison and Ann. The women were born in Utica, New York. In 1978, they also had an older sister named Amy who was 3 years their senior. When the twin girls were 5 years old, their mother Miriam passed away, leaving them to grow up without maternal love and care. The girls were twins, almost identical in facial features and personalities, but there were differences between them. Allison had a more dominant personality and was a leader, while Anne, unlike her sister, was more reserved, balanced, sweet, and kind. Like all twins, the girls did everything together, were inseparable, and sometimes it seemed abnormal how well they could sense each other, as if they had telepathy between them. They could understand what the other needed at any moment, or what the other was about to say before she said it. They were very close and loved each other dearly, but at the same time, there was a kind of toxic, perverse relationship between them, bordering on hatred. Those who knew the twins were amazed at how they could sense each other. If one started to speak, the other could finish her sister's sentences, but throughout their lives, the sisters would fight each other like crazy. Their lives were full of ups and downs, quarrels and terrible fights, then moments of love, and then it would all repeat. Of course, the absence of their mother left an imprint on them, but time passed, the sisters grew up, and in their teens, the girls became interested in yoga, which should have had a beneficial effect on the twins, calming them down and stopping their fights. Indeed, externally, everything seemed quite peaceful. The twins' fascination with yoga led them to the idea of starting their career by opening a joint yoga studio. They found a suitable place around Palm Beach, Florida, invested money, and in 2008 they opened a studio for those who wanted to practice yoga, called Double Power Yoga. This studio opened in 2008, existed for a fairly long period until 2014. The studio immediately became popular. Within 2 months, the yoga school had gained fame in the city, attracting a large number of people who wanted to practice, and the sisters became recognizable personalities, making acquaintances with influential people. The twins' business brought in a good income, and over time the sisters bought identical Porsche cars, which they drove around the city. The girls started living in an elite high-rise building in Palm Beach, dressing in fashionable salons, and continued to spread the idea of practicing yoga, telling everyone how much yoga can help in life. The sisters said that their yoga studio in Palm Beach was the heartbeat of the entire area. The yoga school was thriving, but behind the scenes, where outsiders couldn't see, the relationship between the sisters remained the same as in childhood. They quarreled and fought like teenage girls. As the twins' yoga studio was gaining popularity, they were approached with an offer to star in a reality show that would be about the studio run by twins, as well as about all the dramas in their lives. But for some reason, the release of this project stalled, but the producers, convincing the sisters that the show would definitely be released and that it would be necessary to show the sisters' success, persuaded the girls to rent a more beautiful and spacious premises for yoga classes, and the sisters followed this advice. Despite the fact that the show never materialized, the twins moved to a studio that was more pleasant for them, but the maintenance costs increased and they could no longer fully cover them. Getting a good fee for participating in the show didn't work out for the sisters, and the bills were huge. They gradually began to get into debt, which further aggravated the situation, and in 2014 it was decided to close the studio. The sisters closed the studio in a very peculiar way. They just left. The sisters just abandoned the classes, didn't show up at the studio, didn't pay the employees, didn't return people's money for their participation. And this angered society and turned it against the sisters, because those who came to practice at the studio felt simply robbed. Therefore, the twin sisters left the city and moved to Utah Park City, Utah, and also changed their names, as they planned to write a book in the future, and their names were too well known and frequently appeared on the internet. Because of the failure with the yoga studio, the sisters wanted to start from scratch. Allison changed her name to Alexandria, and Anne became Anastasia. Having settled in a new place, the girls opened another yoga studio, but they no longer had the same success as the first time. Their studio failed, and as a result, the twins found themselves in debt for $150,000 and became bankrupt. At the same time, the relocation, debts, and bankruptcy were accompanied by stress and worries, and the twins began to quarrel more than usual, and to relieve stress, they began to resort to alcohol more often. According to eyewitnesses, while the girls lived in Utah Park City, neighbors repeatedly called the police on them because the sisters drank a lot, loudly argued, and fought. Apparently, the twins were going through very difficult times during this period, were depressed, experiencing depression, and they didn't like living in Utah, so in the end, they packed all their things and went to the most beautiful place on earth, Hawaii. This was in 2015, and interestingly, when the twins said they were going to Hawaii, they added that they were going on a real pilgrimage, ride through holy places, and want to search for the meaning of life. But as soon as the sisters reached their destination, they again faced problems and got into trouble. One time, or rather on Christmas Eve, Alexandria and Anastasia decided to celebrate Christmas in a fun way. As usual, they didn't know when to stop with alcohol. The feast took place in a restaurant where the girls got pretty drunk and, of course, quarreled. Having decided to go home, they, however, did not stop arguing and already near the car began to swear so fiercely that they lost control and drove into a ditch. This happened very close to the restaurant, and the consequences could have been very serious. Fortunately, when the police arrived at the scene, the sisters had already gotten out of the car safe and sound. However, instead of calming down, they continued to swear and even began to insult the restaurant owner. Not understanding what was happening and why they were so angry with him, the sisters, in their drunken frenzy, even threatened him with violence, saying, "We will send the mafia to you. Let them deal with you." Of course, such behavior did not go unnoticed. The police detained the belligerent sisters for hooliganism. As a result, a fine, and it seems a certain sobering up, because after this incident they seemed to calm down a little. Further events showed that pleasant changes also took place in the life of the twins. In 2016, they both found boyfriends and started dating guys. For Alexandria, it was Lonnie Dickerson, and Anastasia started a relationship with Federico Bailey. It would seem that personal life was getting better and the sisters finally found their happiness. But not everything was so cloudless. Once Federico and Anastasia decided to go on a hike. Alexandria was supposed to stay at home. While preparing for the trip and stocking up on groceries at the supermarket, Anastasia accidentally took her sister's credit card instead of her own. Deciding not to use someone else's card, she went back home to get her own. But suddenly Alexandria for some reason changed her mind and decided that she also wanted to join the hike. It is worth noting that Federico, unlike the sisters, perfectly understood the problems associated with alcohol and tried to protect the girls from unnecessary temptation. Therefore, during this trip, he strictly forbade taking any alcoholic beverages with them. But Alexandria, as always, did her own thing. She secretly took a bottle of wine with her and hid it well in the car. When Federico discovered the forbidden alcohol, he was very upset and disappointed. This find caused considerable tension between the participants of the hike. Anastasia, in turn, got angry with her sister for such an irresponsible act. As we can see, even on vacation, in the company of their loved ones, the sisters could not get rid of their old habits and again found themselves in the epicenter of conflict. It would seem that a bottle of wine is a trifle, but it is from such trifles that serious problems often begin. And something tells me that this incident was just the tip of the iceberg. What other surprises did the Duane sisters have in store for their companions during this trip? I will note that after that tense scene with the wine, the company, which consisted of sisters Alexandria and Anastasia, as well as Anastasia's boyfriend Federico, finally reached their destination. The campsite where they stopped was located in a surprisingly picturesque area, surrounded by wonderful views of wildlife. While the girls were unpacking their things, Federico decided to freshen up after the long road and went to the nearest spring. However, when he returned to the camp, he was surprised to find that neither the sisters nor their car were anywhere to be seen. It's hard to even imagine what he felt at that moment: confusion, anxiety, perhaps even fear for his companions. As it later turned out, while Federico was away, Alexandria and Anastasia for some reason decided to get in the car and drive down the road that led to Hana. This highway, by the way, is considered one of the most beautiful in the world, but at the same time one of the most dangerous. It winds between the rocks, sometimes resembling a serpentine more than a road. On one side is a solid stone wall, on the other is an abyss that takes your breath away just by looking at it. In addition, the sharp turns on this road often do not allow you to see if someone is approaching from the opposite direction. And if we add to this the fact that the route is not always well maintained and there are potholes, it becomes clear that traveling on it is a real challenge for the driver. But it seems that the Duane sisters were little concerned about all these dangers. They boldly, if not carelessly, raced along the winding road, paying no attention to either the beauty around them or the risks that lurked at every turn. And all this because they were preoccupied with another argument. It's hard to even imagine what they could argue about at such a crucial moment, because it's obvious that on this road you need to be as attentive and careful as possible. But despite everything, the sisters managed to notice a lonely woman on the side of the road who obviously needed help. Without much thought, they decided to give her a ride. On the way, they asked the hitchhiker where she was heading, and then dropped her off where she asked. It would seem that this good deed should have slightly diffused the atmosphere between the sisters, but as it turned out, it was quite the opposite. As soon as the unfortunate passenger left the car, a simply terrible quarrel broke out between Alexandria and Anastasia, and it happened in the most dangerous place on one of the sharp turns. Later, one of the eyewitnesses of these events told me that he saw with his own eyes how in the car that was passing by, two girls were furiously waving their arms, punching each other with their fists and pulling each other's hair. The guy was dumbfounded by such a sight because he realized that these actions distracted the driver from driving the car, and on a road like the route to Hana out at any moment. But despite the danger of the situation, the eyewitness realized that he could not help in any way. Everything happened so quickly that he wouldn't even have time to react. All he had left was to watch helplessly as the girl at the wheel suddenly accelerated sharply, turned the steering wheel to the left, and the car, breaking off the cliff, flew into the abyss. According to experts, the car fell from a height of about 60 meters and landed right on a pile of sharp stones. The most amazing thing is that it was the only area around the cliff where there was no water. It seems as if some unknown force specifically directed the car to this particular spot. From the strong impact, the car overturned and fell on its roof, so that its license plates were facing the sky. And you know, in this tragic situation, there is one moment that can be called a real miracle. It turns out that the girls were not driving some small car, but a Ford Explorer, a fairly large vehicle. Experts say that if they had been in a smaller car, they would have had practically no chance of surviving. News of the accident spread like wildfire through the surrounding area. The route leading to Hana is quite popular, so people began to gather around the scene of the incident. Everyone looked down in horror at the mangled car lying among the rocks. Someone even called the rescue service by dialing 911. And here the second amazing moment in this story happened. The people who had gathered on the cliff suddenly noticed that someone was moving in the car. It was an almost unbelievable piece of news. It turns out that after such a terrible fall, someone still survived. The police, who arrived at the scene of the accident, immediately began to question numerous witnesses, trying to find out what had happened. And one detail immediately caught their attention. It turns out that on the road surface there were clearly visible traces of tires from the Duane sisters' car. But the strangest thing is that these traces had no signs of braking before the car flew off the cliff. On the contrary, everything indicated that the driver deliberately accelerated and directed the car straight to the edge of the cliff. You must agree that such things do not happen by chance. Meanwhile, rescuers were delivered by helicopter to the scene of the tragedy to check if anyone was left alive in the twisted car. What they saw in the car interior shocked even experienced experts. One of the sisters, Anastasia, was dead. Her body had numerous fractures, and one of the paramedics even compared it to a bag filled with bone fragments. But the real miracle was that the second sister, Alexandria, survived. True, she also had a lot of serious injuries, several broken ribs and a damaged arm. But despite everything, when the girl was pulled out of the wrecked car, she was able to stand on her own feet. And here we come to the most mysterious moment of this story. When the rescuers freed Alexandria from the car, they noticed that she had a lock of blonde hair clenched in her hand, the same color as her dead sister's hair. Most likely, this hair was torn out during the fight that the random eyewitness saw shortly before the accident. But what shocked the investigators the most was Alexandria's behavior. She did not look either frightened or upset about what had just happened. It seemed that the girl was not at all bothered by the fact that she had just miraculously escaped after the car fell from the cliff. And most oddly, she never once asked about her sister's condition, did not ask if Anastasia had survived. Alexandria did not cry, did not sob, did not show her emotions at all. You must agree that such a reaction is on the verge of normal, and it was this that made the investigators wonder. Does this terrible accident hide some terrible secret? Perhaps what happened on the road to Hana was not an accident. After that fatal accident, Alexandria was immediately taken to the hospital, and it was there that she was found by the police, who arrived to conduct an interrogation. From the very beginning, it was clear that the girl was not too willing to cooperate with the investigation. She reluctantly answered questions, and her whole demeanor indicated irritation and dissatisfaction with the presence of the officers. Just imagine the first thing she said to them was, "Why are you here?" During my many years as a detective, I've interrogated a lot of witnesses and suspects, and usually people who have just experienced such a terrible tragedy behave differently. They may be shocked, scared, upset, but indifference is the last thing you expect in such a situation. And another detail that surprised me a lot during the entire conversation with the police officers, Alexandria never once asked about her sister's condition. No worries, no anxiety, absolutely nothing. In the end, the investigators had to inform the girl about Anastasia's death themselves. And you know what struck me the most? The complete absence of any reaction from Alexandria. She listened to this terrible news with a completely empty, indifferent look, without a hint of emotion. You must agree that this is more like the behavior of a person who has long come to terms with the loss, and not one who has just lost the closest person in an instant. But Alexandria's strange reaction is not the biggest surprise in this story. When the twins' father found out about the tragedy, his first words were, "It's a pity that the wrong sister died." That's right, you didn't mishear, the man actually regretted that Anastasia died in the accident and not Alexandria. Such an attitude towards one's own children is, to put it mildly, alarming. Meanwhile, the police continued the investigation and quickly found out that the sisters were fighting right in the car before the accident. This information made the investigators wonder, was the car's fall from the cliff actually Alexandria's deliberate act? Maybe she purposely directed the car towards the abyss to get rid of her sister. Even more suspicions were aroused by the results of the tests, which showed that the level of alcohol in Alexandria's blood was 3 times higher than the permissible norm. That is, the girl was actually heavily drunk behind the wheel and had no right to drive at all, let alone go on such a dangerous trip. The situation was complicated by the fact that at the time of the accident, the girls had no documents with them. It was because of this that the police had to rely on Alexandria's words to establish the identity of the deceased. And the girl, meanwhile, was forced to go home to find her ID and prove that she was indeed herself. The investigators also turned to Lonnie Dickerson, Alexandria's boyfriend, with a request to confirm her identity. When Lonnie was told about the accident and Anastasia's death, his reaction was no less strange than Alexandria's. It seemed that this news did not touch him at all. He just looked at the police officers with an empty, indifferent look. But Federico, Anastasia's boyfriend, was completely unaware of the tragedy. He was still waiting for the girls at the campsite, not understanding where they could have gone. Only the next morning, having got to his friend's place in Hana by hitchhiking, Federico learned the terrible truth. The news of his beloved's death was a real shock for him. The guy was extremely upset and confused, but suddenly remembered something. And believe me, this information greatly interested the investigation. Undoubtedly, the information provided by Federico was a real sensation for the investigation. He said that a week before the tragedy, Alexandria openly stated her intention to kill Anastasia. Moreover, at one point she even said, "I got rid of her," as if the murder had already happened. Such words could not but cause serious concern. True, Federico could not say for sure the reason why Alexandria wished death to her sister, but he suggested that there was a very strong rivalry and mutual jealousy between the girls because of each other's successes. It was hard for the twins to come to terms with the fact that they were so similar in appearance, and this forced them to constantly compete and oppose each other. Federico said that the sisters were constantly trying to outdo each other to prove their uniqueness. It was as if they wanted to tell the world, "Look, we may look like two peas in a pod, but we are different personalities." But despite this, the girls could not stay away from each other for long. Their relationship was a strange combination of love and hate, tenderness and aggression. When they were together, they constantly quarreled and insulted each other, but as soon as they were apart, they already missed their other half. But the strangest thing is that Federico recalled that once, after another heated argument, Alexandria told him, as if in passing, "My sister and I will leave this planet on the 30th. When the guy heard this, he thought that maybe the girls had decided to commit suicide together. But life went on as usual, and gradually this phrase was erased from Federico's memory. Upon hearing such a confession, the investigators became seriously alarmed. A terrible picture began to emerge in their heads. Alexandria deliberately drove the car into the abyss to kill her sister. Of course, one could assume otherwise, for example, that the girls decided to settle scores with life together, or that it was just a tragic coincidence, an accident. But something told the detectives that the answer lay precisely in Alexandria's words, which Federico heard. So the investigators decided to take a closer look at the Duane sisters' car. Fortunately, it was a new, modern car with many technical gadgets, and most importantly, it had a black box like in airplanes. This device records all information about the movement of the car, speed, maneuvers, change of direction, and so on. Thanks to the data from the black box, it was possible to find out an extremely important detail. At the moment the car fell, the brakes were not used. That is, the car was flying off the cliff at full speed. No one even tried to stop, or at least slow down. For the investigators, this was direct evidence that the accident was not an accident. Suspicions were intensified by the fact that the car fell into the abyss exactly where there were only sharp stones at the bottom and not water. It seemed as if someone had specifically chosen this spot for the fall. Moreover, it was here, on this stretch of road, that for some reason there was no protective fence. Everything seemed to come together for the implementation of someone's sinister plan. Experts made another interesting conclusion. Alexandria survived thanks to the deployment of airbags. But Anastasia was not so lucky. She jumped and bumped a lot in the cabin during the fall. Someone even suggested that if at the time of the accident the girl was pulling her sister by the hair, then Alexandria could quite possibly involuntarily turn the steering wheel and press the gas. Having received such testimony and evidence, the investigators decided to bring an official charge against Alexandria. There was only one question left: what motive pushed the girl to such a terrible act? It turns out that shortly before the tragedy, Federico and Anastasia were planning to open their own business on another Hawaiian island. And here we come to a possible motive for the crime. According to the testimony, Alexandria was extremely dissatisfied with the fact that her sister was going to leave her. The girl was so strongly opposed to parting with her twin that she may have decided to resort to the most radical measures. Having gathered all the circumstantial evidence, the investigation was finally able to bring an official charge against Alexandria, the intentional murder of her sister, that is, a second-degree crime. But when the police arrived to arrest the suspect, it turned out that she had already fled the house. It seems that the girl somehow guessed about the possible arrest and decided to hide from justice. But Alexandria apparently forgot about one simple thing: Maui is an island, and you can only leave it in two ways, by sea or by air. So it wasn't too difficult for the police to find out that the girl had booked a plane ticket and that her flight was about to depart. And you know, sometimes fate can be surprisingly ironic. By some coincidence, it was on this plane that a mechanical malfunction occurred and the departure had to be postponed. So instead of being hundreds of kilometers away from the crime scene, Alexandria was forced to stay very close, but she went to wait it out in a nearby hotel. And there she was eventually found and arrested by the police. During the preliminary hearing of the case, Alexandria did not plead guilty to the murder of her sister. And here I would like to draw your attention to one detail. In the footage from the courtroom, you can see that the suspect's hand was not bandaged, although she had previously complained about an injury. Some of those present even suggested that Alexandria could have exaggerated the severity of her injury in order to arouse sympathy from others. The day of the substantive trial came. A large jury gathered on Maui, and Alexandria was officially charged with killing her sister. For this, the girl was taken to Hawaii to personally face justice. The process began on January 29, 2018. At first, Alexandria looked very excited and scared. No wonder, after all, she was facing life imprisonment. One of the key witnesses in this case was the same random passer-by who saw with his own eyes how the sisters were fiercely fighting in the car shortly before the accident. The man described in detail what he saw, how Anastasia pulled her sister by the hair, pulled her head to herself and punched her with her fists. This testimony formed the basis of the defense's version, according to which Alexandria, being behind the wheel, could have lost control of the car from pain and shock. Allegedly not seeing the road clearly due to her sister's attack, the girl could have unintentionally directed the car into the abyss. Then Federico, the deceased Anastasia's boyfriend, was questioned on the witness stand. He spoke about Alexandria's strange and disturbing behavior after the tragedy. According to him, the girl tried to establish closer contact with him, suggested taking a shower together, began to wear her sister's things. Federico admitted that he was shocked and repelled by such actions. Despite the outward resemblance to his beloved, he categorically refused to get close to Alexandria. But despite all this testimony, the suspect's lawyers insisted that it was Anastasia who caused the fatal accident. Allegedly, by attacking her sister, she provoked her to rash actions. The defense also referred to the results of the examination, according to which the car's wheel was changed shortly before the accident so one of the tires was completely smooth. Given that the road was wet that day, and the sister's car was initially swaying due to the fight inside the cabin, it could well have happened that Alexandria simply could not cope with driving on the slippery road. So the court faced a difficult question. What really happened that fatal day on the road to Hana? Was the accident really an accident caused by a combination of factors, or was there a malicious intent behind it? And most importantly, is Alexandria guilty of her sister's death? The answer to these questions was to be given by the jury. So after hearing all the available evidence, the judge reached a conclusion and announced his decision. According to it, Alexandria was not responsible for the accident and the death of her sister, and therefore she was immediately acquitted. In the judge's opinion, the accused lost control of the vehicle, and perhaps she did indeed turn on the left turn signal. But even if she did, the evidence shows that the car was being heavily shaken from side to side due to the fight inside the cabin. The judge noted that the mere probability that Alexandria could have driven the car into the abyss is not sufficient for a guilty verdict. This requires strong and indisputable evidence of intent, and in this case they were absent. Instead, eyewitness accounts and expert findings rather indicated that the accident was the result of a fatal coincidence of circumstances: bad weather conditions, a slippery road, lack of fencing in a dangerous area, and most importantly, a merciless fight between the sisters that distracted the driver from driving. As a detective, this court decision seems rather controversial to me. Is it possible to exclude intent in a situation where one sister openly threatened to kill the other? Can it be considered an accident that the crash occurred in the very place where there were only sharp rocks below? After all, isn't it strange that Alexandria, despite the death of her twin, behaved as if nothing special had happened? These questions will probably never have unambiguous answers. Opinions on Alexandria's guilt were divided. Some consider her a completely innocent victim of a tragic coincidence. For others, she remains the main suspect who managed to escape punishment by cunning. Alexandria herself insists on her non-involvement in what happened. According to her, she misses Anastasia very much and is deeply saddened by everything that happened. But whether she can be believed is another question. Taylor Bell, a high school graduate from the small town of Vienna in the state of Virginia, USA, decided to enter Virginia Commonwealth University. This educational institution, located in the state capital of Richmond, was famous for its first-class infrastructure and vibrant nightlife that revolved around the student body. The university, known for its achievements in the field of biotechnology, had about 30,000 students. For Taylor, the university's location was ideal, as it allowed her not to move too far away from her caring mother. Initially, the girl often traveled between the two cities, living for some time in Richmond with close friends of her parents. But later, she decided to settle directly on the university campus. On September 5, 2005, Taylor Bell intended to visit one of the local restaurants to have dinner with her friend Ben. After the meal, the student planned to skateboard with him through the city streets at night and then return to campus. That same morning, Taylor met with Ben to borrow his skateboard for a while, intending to return it in the evening. Around 10 in the evening, after meeting her friend, the girl came to the dormitory. However, her roommate was spending time with her boyfriend and asked Taylor not to disturb them. The girl agreed to leave, taking only her car keys, cell phone, and $40 in cash.
Her purse was left in the room. Before leaving, the heroine told her roommate that she would return in a couple of hours. Contrary to her promise, Taylor did not appear in the dormitory either at the specified time or even the next day. The girl stopped communicating, did not respond on social networks, behaved very atypically for herself. Attempts to call her turned out to be futile, and all text messages sent through messengers remained unread. On September 7, 2005, the girl's mother went to the police with a statement about her daughter's disappearance. Law enforcement officers treated this without much enthusiasm, believing that the adult girl had just gone out somewhere and would soon return on her own. After all, students disappear almost every day, but in 99% of cases, such stories end with the favorable return of young people. Guys and girls can disappear for several days or more, spending time at parties with friends. A week had passed since Taylor's disappearance, and the police officers had not found out anything. Under pressure from the missing girl's relatives, the officers finally took the case seriously. They checked Taylor's activity on social networks and on her mobile phone, but found that the girl had completely stopped using them. This convinced law enforcement that the family was telling the truth, that something bad had happened to Taylor. Moreover, all the girl's things, including clothes, cosmetics, money, and a purse, were left in the dorm room. Taylor had never been out for long without these things before. In addition, no transfers or payments were recorded on her bank cards, which finally convinced the detectives of the seriousness of the situation. The police turned to the public for help through the media, but unfortunately this did not yield any results. Soon, Taylor's car was found, a white 1997 Ford Escort. It was parked just a few kilometers from the university campus. Law enforcement decided to put the car under surveillance for at least 12 hours, hoping that the likely criminal would return to it. Unfortunately, this did not happen, so the car was sent for examination. Taylor had no idea that her disappearance would become a real nightmare for the police, and especially for her loved ones. At the initial stage of the investigation, the detectives came across the first alarming find. It turned out that license plates stolen 2 months before the girl's disappearance were installed on Taylor's car. This suggested the involvement of a quick-witted and knowledgeable criminal in the case. As it became known, the numbers were registered in the state of Ohio. Investigators found that they belonged to a former resident of that state who had recently moved to Richmond. The owner of the numbers turned out to be a student who had previously reported their theft to the police. His words were confirmed, so suspicions were removed from him. In fact, such a trick was not something extraordinary, because some criminals resort to such tricks in order to confuse the trail and gain extra time. To obtain more information, experts from various fields were involved in the inspection of Taylor's vehicle. However, despite a thorough examination, this did not yield any results. Analyzing the missing girl's social circle, investigators immediately drew attention to a 38-year-old amateur photographer named Ben Foley, with whom Taylor was friends and met shortly before her disappearance. The man had no alibi for that evening. His testimony was confused and contradictory. He could not clearly explain where exactly he spent the night after Taylor's disappearance.
Ben's apartment was of particular interest to detectives. They obtained search warrants for his home, as well as the room on campus that the missing girl shared with her roommate. The man immediately got on the list of suspects because after questioning, investigators concluded that there was an intimate relationship between him and Taylor, and that he was clearly hiding something. During a check of Ben's computer, shocking facts were discovered. It turned out that the man owned several sites where he posted quite specific content. On one of these resources, he published photos of naked and half-naked girls, and all of them were much younger than him. Some of them were minors. There were even pictures of very young children aged 3-4 years. The missing girl also posed for Ben. Taylor's mother was convinced that the photographer was using her daughter's photos illegally. In addition to these dubious activities, Ben had a criminal history related to stalking and domestic violence. Immediately after the start of the investigation, it was noticed that the man began to hastily delete his sites, probably trying to hide something from the police. He even sent a message to his subscribers about the need for an urgent cleaning. It should be noted that Taylor lived in the early 2000s, when young people were just beginning to actively use the internet. It was all new. Previously, in order to find out something about a person's identity, it was necessary to communicate with them personally or with their immediate environment for a long time. However, the example of Taylor and Ben clearly demonstrated to detectives how easy it is to obtain valuable information about a person from social networks. Studying the girl's digital footprint on the internet, the police paid attention to her profile on the suspect's website. Here, Taylor appeared completely different than in real life. Instead of a self-confident, sociable, and active girl, she seemed a frightened and withdrawn person. Judging by the restrained description in the profile, she was looking for new acquaintances in Richmond, since she had recently moved and did not know many people in this city yet. Investigators managed to find out that Taylor last logged into this site on September 4, 2005, less than a day before her disappearance. That day, the girl actively corresponded with several friends. Basically, these were light, easy conversations with jokes. Already after Taylor disappeared and people began to worry about her, a huge number of messages with words of love and support were sent to her address. Numerous friends of the girl by correspondence sincerely wished that she would return home as soon as possible, safe and sound. They did not even suspect what the heroine of this story really had to go through. Police uncovered the main suspect's dark secrets step by step, and there turned out to be quite a few of them. Having analyzed the history of correspondence over the past few months, the detectives concluded that most of Taylor's online communication consisted of dialogues with Ben. As it turned out, very frank conversations took place between them, from which it followed that the couple had an intimate relationship once, and this happened even before the girl moved to the campus in Richmond. The missing girl's friend reported that after intimacy with Ben, Taylor no longer wanted to maintain an intimate relationship with him, but continued to communicate as a friend. Also, police officers noticed that after the start of the investigation, Ben began to hastily delete and edit his messages, which only increased their suspicions that the man had something to hide. The relationship between Ben and Taylor also included shooting explicit photos. Even before moving to Richmond, the girl repeatedly visited Ben. For meetings, they chose unusual locations, for example, abandoned old buildings. Of course, this is not the best place for dates, but Ben insisted on such conditions for creating explicit shots. He believed that the gloomy atmosphere was ideal for the embodiment of his ideas, and he considered his work as works of art. In many messages, the name of the couple's favorite place was mentioned, Belle Isle, located on the James River in the very heart of the city. Analyzing the correspondence, the investigators concluded that Taylor herself, despite her young age, took the initiative in the relationship with Ben. At the same time, the police suggested that an adult man still had some influence on the girl, because the age difference was a whole 20 years. Taylor herself, in her messages, called this difference life experience and did not see anything wrong with it. An important role in the investigation was played by Taylor's personal diaries, which the detectives managed to find. These records reflected the typical experiences of a teenager who had already left childhood but had not yet reached full maturity. Here were doubts, fears, anxieties, and thoughts that the girl could not share with anyone. For his part, Ben was known for his attraction to very young girls. All these facts, together with the history of violations of the law, played against him. Of course, Taylor, being a student, did not suspect that Ben was publishing explicit photos in which he posed on the internet. The girl sincerely believed that they were doing art solely for themselves, and no outsiders would see these pictures. According to investigators, she became another victim of the alleged criminal. From the pages of the diary, the police learned that Taylor met with different men, preferring those older than herself. Her idol was actor Johnny Depp, whose features she subconsciously sought in every adult acquaintance. Many believed that Ben outwardly resembled a celebrity. Perhaps this is what attracted the girl to him. At that time, there was no information about Taylor's fate. Detectives continued to question her inner circle. The parents told the investigators the story of their daughter's life. For some time, the family lived in Great Britain and Belgium, often moving from place to place, since the girl's mother was married to an officer of the Royal Air Force. After the breakup of that marriage, the mother and daughter were able to return to their native Virginia. The woman got married several more times, but these attempts also turned out to be unsuccessful. Taylor was a very energetic girl with a compliant character. Very smart, sometimes even too much for her age. These traits helped her quickly adapt to new schools. In total, young Taylor changed about 15 educational institutions before receiving a certificate and entering university. Everywhere, she easily made friends and made acquaintances. Sometimes the girl seemed too soft and trusting. For a long time, the mother tried to protect her daughter, believing that she was not yet ready for an independent adult life. The biography of the missing girl turned out to be full of ambiguous facts and secrets. The mother described Taylor as a willful and energetic girl. She grew up in a privileged environment surrounded by conservative and wealthy people. However, Taylor wanted to know the other side of life too, so after entering university, she decided to move to another city and settle on campus in order to achieve her goals on her own. Unfortunately, the young student did not even realize the dangers that could lurk behind the walls of a student dormitory. Despite good intentions, such places also have a dark side. Sometimes they turn into a real hotbed of undesirable phenomena among young people. Theft, substance abuse, promiscuous sexual relations. Since students are in close contact with each other, all this begins to manifest itself more clearly. At the same time, the vast majority of dorm residents are really focused on studying and getting an education. Without a wealth of life experience, it is very difficult to objectively assess the situation, which is what happened to Taylor. In the opinion of law enforcement officers, the missing girl made several serious mistakes at once. First of all, this concerns the relationship with a man who was twice her age, had convictions and mental health problems. A former girlfriend and a former roommate confirmed that Ben suffered from bipolar disorder, had sharp mood swings, and problems with anger control. In addition, detectives considered Taylor's decision to leave campus after 10 in the evening fatal. No one accompanied her, and she simply disappeared in the dark. And what is your opinion on this? Write in the comments, I will be interested to read. Investigators began compiling lists of dormitory neighbors who aroused suspicion. Police officers identified several students who were actively involved in the distribution of narcotic substances on campus. However, their alibi was confirmed. The mother of the missing girl suggested that the attack on Taylor could have been committed by several attackers. However, the most suspicious figure in this story remained 38-year-old Ben Foley, and detectives continued to closely investigate his identity. The man led a very active life on the internet. He owned several websites on various topics and revealed a lot of information about himself. Ben's subscribers even knew his shoe size, but compared to some of his thematic resources, this data seemed like a trifle. One of the most creepy turned out to be a site where a man published his distorted vision of beauty. He considered it creativity, but to detectives it seemed evidence of serious mental problems. On this resource, Ben combined images of naked bodies of models much younger than him, with images of death, decaying flesh, and gothic motives. He often used real animal bones and skulls in his work. As it turned out, Ben managed to intrigue the 17-year-old student with his gloomy creativity. This is where their relationship began. It became known that before disappearing, Taylor felt lonely. In her notes, the girl admitted that she missed her friends who remained in her hometown. She had close friends and comrades, and in Richmond she had not yet managed to make enough acquaintances. Probably, that's why she communicated with the eccentric Ben. Of course, a passion for creepy images in itself did not make him a kidnapper, rapist, or murderer. But in combination with other facts of the man's biography, it caused more and more serious concerns. Studying Ben's online activity, police noticed that he displayed two completely different personalities. On the one hand, he appeared as a kind, loving, vulnerable, and creative person. On the other hand, numerous ex-girlfriends who posed for his photographs complained about him. Several former passions claimed that Ben was jealous, cruel, aggressive, and dangerous. Some girls even became victims of physical violence at his hands, although these episodes were too insignificant to report to the police. Instead, they simply broke off relations with the man after the first manifestations of aggression. But could an inexperienced 17-year-old student react incorrectly to such behavior and provoke an outburst of anger that led to murder? Suspicions about Ben Foley grew, but direct evidence was still lacking. Suddenly, on September 23, 2005, a new post appeared on Taylor's social media page. At 11:24 a.m., a message was published in which the girl claimed that she was fine and would soon return to her family. She mentioned some problems that needed to be urgently resolved, but did not go into details. Taylor's page gained considerable popularity after her disappearance and was under the close attention of many people. Therefore, the news of this post instantly spread around the city. However, the police considered the post an attempt at staging, as no one had yet managed to contact Taylor. Law enforcement officers did not believe that this message was written by the girl herself. On the same day that the new post appeared, The main suspect, Ben Foley, was arrested on charges of creating and storing pornographic materials involving minors. But the man insisted that none of the photographs found in his apartment belonged to him. According to him, these pictures were left by the previous tenant of the dwelling. At this stage of the investigation, the police had not yet charged Ben with official charges of involvement in Taylor's disappearance. In fact, he was not the only suspect in this case, but he certainly turned out to be the most colorful figure on the list. Given the time that had passed, the likelihood that the girl was still alive was extremely low. However, the investigators did not yet have convincing evidence against Foley. In any case, the trial regarding the obscene photos gave the detectives extra time to work while the suspect was behind bars. Meanwhile, the police came across a strange post by Ben published on September 8th. According to his story, he was attacked that evening. The man even had to file a report about this with the police. In one of his blogs, he described this incident in detail. According to Ben, 3 or 4 attackers attacked him. They immediately put a black bag over his head so he could not see their faces. Foley got away without serious injuries, but the attackers threw him out of the car somewhere on the outskirts of the city in the morning. They stole $20 from him, a camera and a tripod. The man had to walk to the city for a long time. However, during searches in his house, investigators found several expensive tripods and professional filming equipment at once. Such a variety of equipment looked suspicious, because officially Ben did not work anywhere and lived on disability benefits due to bipolar disorder. The main suspect definitely could not afford such expensive purchases while receiving only state payments. Investigators intensified their efforts, trying to gather as much evidence as possible during a search of Foley's home. They managed to find several boxes with provocative items, from cold weapons, such as a huge machete, to sadomasochistic paraphernalia. Of course, the man claimed that all this was a prop for photo shoots. In addition, a suspicious stain resembling blood was found in Ben's house. Samples were sent for analysis. After the publication in the media of information about the seized items, suspicions about the amateur photographer with eccentric artistic views only intensified. Interestingly, the bloodstain was found on the man's bed spring frame.
Experienced police officers immediately asked themselves the question, how much blood would have to be shed for it to soak through the mattress and reach the springs? During searches of the area around Foley's house, several strange items were found in a dumpster, including a necklace and a watch. Clearly not the kind of accessories that people usually just get rid of. The police were also puzzled by the huge machete found in Ben's home. However, according to his statements, it served as a prop for photo shoots. In addition, the machete allegedly helped him make his way through dense thickets on the way to abandoned buildings and chop wood for a fire. In fact, the police had at least one more suspect named Jesse Schultz, whom they also thoroughly checked. It turned out that this was a 22-year-old student whose trail was managed to be found with the help of service dogs. When Taylor's car was found, specially trained dogs were used to search for the alleged criminal's scent traces. In the end, the scent trail led to the house where this young man lived. According to Jesse's confession, he began dating Taylor in August 2005. It was during this period, almost immediately after the girl moved to Richmond, that alarming entries appeared in her diaries. The Schultz family turned out to be the same friends of Taylor's father with whom she lived in the first days after arriving in the city. Despite all the efforts of the investigators, the truth about what happened to Taylor turned out to be much more terrible than they could have imagined. Taylor immediately began to complain about the son of the Schultz couple. According to the girl, the young man was so intrusive in his courtship of her that she no longer felt safe under their roof. This is what caused her to move to the university campus. However, Taylor did not mention that they were dating. After the service dogs picked up the trail that led to Jesse, law enforcement officers conducted thorough searches in his home. Traces of narcotic substances were found in the guy's room, which gave grounds for his detention. However, no concrete evidence of Jesse's involvement in Taylor's disappearance was found. In addition, he had a reliable alibi, so his name was soon crossed off the list of suspects. On October 5th, 2005, investigators spoke with one of the missing girl's friends named Kevin. Despite the fact that they only met 4 times in total, this was enough for Kevin to get the impression of Taylor as an extremely trusting person. In addition, in his opinion, the girl was quite pliable and easily influenced by others. The last time they saw Taylor was the day before her disappearance. At that time, the girl seemed very inspired and excited. On the eve of her 18th birthday, she confessed to Kevin that she was going to do something risky, but did not specify what she meant. The guy suggested that it was about some kind of photo shoot. Already post factum, Kevin found out about Taylor's disappearance. On the same day, he turned to the police to tell about the recent events in the girl's life that he had to witness. In particular, it was during that meeting that he first saw Ben Foley, whom Taylor introduced as her photographer friend. Kevin immediately felt hostility towards this man because he made a very suspicious impression on him. Later, Ben himself contacted Kevin, trying to find Taylor, because he could not do it on his own. The guy had a clear feeling that the photographer was hiding something. Throughout October, the search for the missing girl continued. Police officers examined numerous locations in the vicinity of Richmond. These were places that Ben photographed as part of his project dedicated to highlighting the city's problems. One of these objects even had a separate blog of the man dedicated to it. About 100 kilometers from Richmond, in Matthews County, the body of a young woman was found in a shallow pit. It was impossible to identify her on the spot due to significant damage. The body was in a terrible condition. The soft tissues had significantly decomposed due to environmental influences and the activity of small animals like wild dogs. It was a horrifying sight, and one of the forensic experts literally could not stop his mouth from gagging at what he saw. Identification of the deceased's identity became possible only thanks to the recognition of fragments of clothing by her mother. In the end, the examination finally confirmed that the found remains belonged to the missing Taylor Bell. The woman was devastated by grief and vowed to make every effort to punish the monster who committed this terrible crime against her daughter. The place where the body was found was established, thanks to photographs taken by Ben. The attention of law enforcement officers was attracted by one of the locations that the man had been excessively interested in recently.
It was decided to carefully examine the outbuildings located there, which brought results. The body of the deceased was found behind one of the barns on private property. Experts found that soil particles from the tires of Taylor's car were identical to soil samples taken near the barn. This indicated that the criminal had transported the body in the girl's car and then drove the car to another location. Most likely, Taylor was attacked almost immediately after she left the campus. It took no more than a few hours before she was dead. Fragments of duct tape were found on the remains of the body, suggesting that the girl was held tied up. Police turned to Ben Foley for comment. He claimed that the abduction was planned and carried out by his ex-girlfriend with the participation of several beefy young men. He himself was allegedly under the influence of drugs, did not directly participate in this madness, and does not remember anything. However, this testimony sounded extremely unconvincing. After confirmation of the worst fears, Taylor's family was waiting for only one thing: justice. After the discovery of the body, all the attention of the local community was riveted to the person of the eccentric amateur photographer. The fact is that Taylor's remains were found near Chesapeake Bay, in an area that had repeatedly appeared in Ben's photographs. This indicated that for a man, this location had a special, perhaps even sacred meaning. The version of a random coincidence was immediately rejected, because Foley was the last to see the girl alive on that fatal evening. In addition, he was previously noticed in such a strange activity as collecting car license plates. Creepy details from Ben's past surfaced. In particular, an incident when he attacked his ex-girlfriend with such rage that the poor girl managed to say goodbye to life. After that attack, the defendant even inflicted bodily injuries on himself. The conflict reached such a serious scale that the girl, miraculously saved, was forced to take a restraining order against her ex-boyfriend. An internet investigation revealed a whole series of similar cases of Ben's inappropriate behavior towards his passions. Gradually, the level of aggression in his actions only increased. All these facts formed in the eyes of detectives the image of a mentally unstable man with deviant tendencies who lured young, trusting girls into his networks. On January 17, 2006, Ben Foley was officially charged with the abduction, rape, and willful murder of Taylor Bell. Unfortunately, due to the extremely poor preservation of the body, forensic experts were never able to accurately determine all the circumstances of the girl's death. This led to the fact that already in February, serious amendments had to be made to the initial charges. At that time, the suspect was already serving a sentence for storing pornographic materials depicting minors. In the end, in August, Ben made a deal with the investigation and pleaded guilty to the crimes he was charged with, albeit very selectively choosing the wording. According to his version of events, that evening, he met with Taylor immediately after she left the campus. Together, they went to a deserted place, where in the back seat of the car, Ben allegedly tied the girl's hands behind her back with duct tape, after which they had rough consensual sex. Then, in a fit of passion, the man allegedly accidentally strangled his partner. He left the body in the forest, and the next day he returned to hide the remains. Most of the facts cited by Ben remained unsubstantiated allegations that are difficult to prove. Although the forensic expert was unable to unequivocally determine the cause of Taylor's death, he insisted on its violent nature. After all, even with accidental strangulation, it takes effort for several minutes for a lethal result to occur. So the attacker could have released the victim at any time. The prosecution insisted that Ben deliberately tied the girl's wrists, not for sexual games, but to deprive her of the opportunity to resist. And this meant that the whole story he voiced was a complete lie and the events unfolded in a completely different way. Foley stood his ground, assuring that the duct tape was part of a role-playing game. However, no one believed this version. Taylor's friends stated that she was never interested in extreme sexual practices such as asphyxia or bondage. While recreating the picture of events described by the accused, the investigators came to an unambiguous conclusion that the scenario he voiced does not stand up to any criticism. In the cramped space of a car, and even with her hands tied behind her back, the girl would be in an extremely uncomfortable and vulnerable position. Taking into account Taylor's character and habits, it is unlikely that she would voluntarily agree to this. A much more plausible version looked like Ben kidnapped, raped, and then killed his victim. The main motive for the crime was considered the girl's refusal to have an intimate relationship with Foley. During the court session, the prosecutor read out a letter that the defendant sent to his ex-girlfriend. It contained the following lines: "I am the cause of Taylor's death. I deserve imprisonment." These words could well be interpreted as an admission of guilt. Ben decided to make a deal with the prosecution and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The rest of the charges against him were dropped. In February 2006, the hapless photographer was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Taylor's mother was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. Now the woman knew that the soul killer who took the life of her only daughter had been justly punished.